Hey yo. Um I decided I could probably knock this out real quick. Like just reading this book because it's only 70 pages. I've read this in an afternoon at my old job and it was really good. It was I think the Metamorphosis is one of the most important pieces of literature I've ever read. And I'm going to say um, what I think regarding it more in the video I have planned for Gregor. Excuse me. I'm stumbling over my words like crazy, but yeah. Better than The Stranger? No. But it is good. I don't feel like comparing two good works of fiction like this really solves anything. I mean, fuck. Not works of fiction, books like the, well, yeah, they are fictitious, but it's sad at this point. I don't think, like, comparing them, it's like apples to oranges. You know? That's what I'm just trying to get at. Alright. Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. This is the David Wiley translation. My copy of Metamorphosis was this big square book. And it's only 38 pages there, but it contains basically like 2 pages on 1 page. Instead of this book, instead of being told in first person, is told in third person regarding Gregor, compared to Marcel and the Stranger, who read in first person. So we'll see some of Gregor's thoughts, but like it won't be as descriptive and as detailed. You just have to imagine the scene around you, basically. All right. One morning when Gregor Samsa woke from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a horrible vermin. He lay on his armor-like back, and if he lifted his head a little, he could see his brown belly, slightly domed and divided by arches into stiff sections. The bedding was hardly able to cover it, and seemed ready to slide off any moment. His many legs, pitifully thin compared with the size of the rest of him, waved around helplessly as he looked. "What's happened to me?" he thought. It wasn't a dream. His room, a proper human room, although a little too small, lay peacefully between its 4 familiar walls. A collection of textile samples lay spread out on the table. Samsa was a traveling salesman, and above it there hung a picture that he had recently cut out of an illustrated magazine and housed in a nice gilded frame. It showed a lady fitted out with a fur hat and fur boa, who sat upright, raising a heavy fur muff that covered the whole of her lower arm towards the viewer. Sorry, I have something stuck in my mouth. Gregor then turned to look out the window at the dull weather. Drops of rain could be heard hitting the pane, which made him feel quite sad. How about if I sleep a little longer and forget all this nonsense? He thought. But that was something he was unable to do because he was used to sleeping on his right, and in his present state, he couldn't get into that position. However hard he threw himself onto his right, he always rolled back to where he was. He must have tried it hundreds of times. Shut his eyes so that he wouldn't have to look at the floundering legs, and only stopped when he began to feel a mild, dull pain there that he had never felt before. Oh God, he thought, what a strenuous career it is that I have chosen. Traveling day in and day out, doing business like this takes much more effort than doing your own business at home. And on top of that, there's the curse of traveling, worries about making train connections, bad and irregular food, contact with different people all the time so that you can never get to know anyone or become friendly with them. It can all go to hell. He felt a slight itch up on his belly, pushed himself slowly up on his back towards the headboard so that he could lift his head better, found where the itch was, and saw that it was covered with lots of little white spots which he didn't know what to make of. And when he tried to feel the place with one of his legs, he drew it quickly back because as soon as he touched it, he was overcome by a cold shudder. He slid back into his former position. Getting up early all the time, he thought. It makes you stupid. You've got to get enough sleep. Other traveling salesmen live a life of luxury, for instance. Whenever I go back to the guest house during the morning to copy out a contract, these gentlemen are always still sitting there eating their breakfast. I ought to just try that with my boss. I'd get kicked out on the spot, but who knows, maybe that would be the best thing for me. If I didn't have my parents to think about, I'd have given in my notice a long time ago. I'd have gone up to the boss and told him just what I think. Tell him everything I would. Let him know just what I feel. He'd fall right off his desk. It's a funny sort of business to be sitting up there at your desk, talking down at your subordinates from up there. Especially when you have to go right up close because the boss is hard of hearing. Well, there's still some hope. Once I've got the money together to pay off my parents' debt to him, another 5 or 6 years, I suppose. That's definitely what I'll do. That's when I'll make my big change. First of all, though, I've got to get up. My train leaves at 5. And he looked over at the alarm clock ticking on the chest of drawers. God in heaven, he thought. It was 6:30, and the hands were quietly moving forwards. It was even later than 7:30, more like 7:15. Had the alarm clock not rung? He could see from the bed that it had been set to 4 o'clock as it should have been. It certainly must have rung. Yes, but was it possible to quietly sleep through the furniture rattling noise? True, he had not slept peacefully, but probably all the more deeply because of that. What should he do now? The next train went at 7. If he were to catch that, he would have to rush like mad, and the collection of samples was still not packed, and he did not at all feel particularly fresh and lively. And even if he did catch the train, he would not be able to avoid his boss's anger, as the office assistant would have been there to see the 5 o'clock train go. He would have been put in his report about Gregor's not being there a long time ago. The office assistant was the boss's man, spineless and with no understanding. What about if he reported sick? That would be extremely strange and suspicious, as in 15 years of service, Gregor had never once yet been ill. His boss would certainly come round with the doctor from the medical insurance company, accuse his parents of having a lazy son, and accept the doctor's recommendation not to make any claims, as the doctor believed that no one was ever ill, but that many were work shy. And what's more, would he have been entirely wrong in this case? Typical German worried about work even like this. Isn't he Austrian? Like, specifically? Or am I just, like, Jewish Austrian or something? Or am I, like, overlooking this? Am I, like, thinking too much into Franz Kafka? And what's more, would he have been entirely wrong in this case? Gregor did, in fact, apart from excessive sleepiness after sleeping for so long, feel completely well and even felt much hungrier than usual. He was still hurriedly thinking all of this through, unable to decide to get out of the bed, when the clock struck 7:15. There's a cautious knock at the door near his head. Gregor? Somebody called in. It was his mother. It's 7:15. Didn't you want to go somewhere? That gentle voice! Gregor was shocked when he heard his own voice answering. He could hardly be recognized as the voice he had heard before, as if from deep inside him there was a painful and uncontrollable squeaking mixed within it. The words could be made out at first, but there was a sort of echo which made them unclear, leaving the hearer unsure whether he had heard properly or not. Gregor had wanted to give a full answer and explain everything, but in the circumstances contented himself with him saying, "Yes, mother, yes, thank you. I'm getting up now." The change in Gregor's voice probably could not be noticed outside through the wooden door, as his mother was satisfied with this explanation and shuffled away. I might also be misremembering stuff, but this is still peak German behavior if we are physically able, we work. Oh, you're German? That's cool. But this short conversation made the other members of the family aware that Gregor, against their expectations, was still at home, and soon his father came knocking at one of the side doors gently, but with his fist. Gregor, Gregor, he called. What's wrong? And after a short while, he called again with worrying deepness in his voice. Gregor! Gregor! At the other side of the door, his sister came plaintively. Gregor, aren't you well? Do you need anything? Gregor answered to both sides. I'm ready, now, making an effort to remove all the strainedness from his voice by enunciating very carefully and putting long pauses between each individual word. His father went back to his breakfast, but his sister whispered, Gregor, open the door, I beg of you. Gregor, however, had no thought of opening the door, and instead congratulating himself for his cautious habit, acquired from his traveling, of locking all doors at night even when he was at home. You can see, like, even early on, like, this is, like, the 5th page of the book. He does not want to worry his family so fucking bad. He does not want to be a nuisance to them. He does not want, even though, like, his family is there to love and support him, he does not want to be in their way at all. He sees himself as a nuisance. And in this, he doesn't see himself as a nuisance yet. He sees himself as, someone, a provider, like a sole provider for his family, right? Basically working off their debts, not expecting anything in return, and because he's just trying to make less problems for them, basically. And the only times that you'll hear him speak selfishly is, like, him talking about, like, calling in sick to work, but that's just a solution, he thought hurriedly. Anywho, Gregor Samsa in the book is, in my opinion, very selfless. From, if I'm remembering my first read through correctly, he does seem to be not only the sole provider, but the sole support in the family when it comes to paying off the debt. I think I remember the dad's employed. I don't know, but I think they, like, rent out a room to. They do rent out a room later on to cover bills. So I don't know. Anyways, the first thing he wanted to do was get up in peace without being disrupted, to get dressed, and most of all, to have his breakfast. Only then would he consider what to do next, as he was well aware that he would not bring his thoughts to any sensible conclusions by lying in bed. He remembered that he had often felt a slight pain in his bed, perhaps caused by lying awkwardly, but that had always turned out to be pure imagination, and he wondered how his imaginings would slowly resolve themselves today. He did not have the slightest doubt that the change in his voice was nothing more than the first sign of a serious cold, which was an occupational hazard for traveling salesmen. It was a simple matter to throw off the covers. He only had to blow himself up a little and they fell off by themselves. But it became difficult after that, especially as he was so exceptionally broad. He would have used his arms and his hands to push himself up, but instead of them, he had only these little legs continuously moving in different directions, and which he was moreover unable to control. The dad is unemployed at first. Yeah, I knew. Okay, thank you for reminding me. If he wanted to bend one of them, then that was the first one that would stretch itself out, and if he managed to do what he wanted with that leg, all the others seemed to be set free and would move about painfully. This is something that can't be done in bed, Gregor said to himself, so don't keep trying to do it. The first thing he wanted to do was get the lower part of his body out of the bed. But he had never seen this lower part and could not imagine what it looked like. It turned out to be too hard to move, it went so slowly, and finally, almost in a frenzy. When he carelessly shoved himself towards with all the force he could gather, he chose the wrong direction, hit hard against the lower bedpost, and leaned from the burning pain. He felt that the lower part of his body might well, at present, be the most sensitive. So when he tried to get the top part of his body out of the bed first, carefully turning his head to the side, this he managed quite easily, and despite its breadth and its weight, the bulk of his body eventually followed slowly in the direction of the head. But when he had at last got his head out of the bed and into the fresh air, it occurred to him that if he had himself fall, it would be a miracle if his head were not injured. So he became afraid to carry on, pushing himself forward the same way, and he could not knock himself out now at any price. Better to stay in bed than lose consciousness. I'm not gonna like do the ELA teacher and like stop when I have every sort of single thought, but this is like the first like indication in this book of disability, specifically about the lower part of his body it being the most sensitive, which in my opinion, like describing how like difficult it is to move around his room, that actually can represent a loss of motor function. If we take off the veil of like he's literally a fucking cockroach right now, this is actually talking about motor function in the body and how his is impaired, because there's a lot of things like degenerative diseases and disorders over time that can affect your brain that will just fucking annihilate your motor functions and your nerves in like some parts of your body. I have a friend who I play fighting games with, and he kicks my ass, by the way. I gotta paraphrase, he kicks my ass. He is slowly losing the motor functions in his hands. And you know what? He beats me like shit whenever we play Street Fighter 6. He fucking kicks my ass. He puts me in the dirt. Because that's my goat right there. But, yeah. So, neurodegenerative diseases, like, things that just, like, over time will just, like, disable, nerves needed for movement will just, are what comes to mind whenever I read this passage. Anyways, I'm not gonna, like, stop until I, like, see something big. We good? Cool? Cool. Alright. It took just as much effort to get back to where he had been earlier, but when he lay there sighing and was once more watching his legs as they struggled against each other even harder than before, if that was possible, he could think of no way of bringing peace and order to this chaos. He told himself once more that it was not possible for him to stay in bed, and that the most sensible thing to do would get free of it in whatever way he could at whatever sacrifice. At the same time, though, he did not forget to remind himself that calm consideration was much better than rushing to desperate conclusions. At times like this, he would direct his eyes to the window and look out as clearly as he could, but unfortunately, even the other side of the narrow street was enveloped in morning fog, and the view had little confidence or cheer to offer him. Also, I thought Gregor became a beetle, or is it a different interpretation? It's only described... Okay. Where it is... Let's get this out of the way. Where it is described, he's described as a horrible vermin, laying on his armor-like back, could see his brown belly slightly domed and divided by arches into stiff sections. And it only describes him having like creepy little legs. That could like apply to a lot of bugs. Unless if there's like something later on that says like, oh, my name is Gregor Samsa and I turned into a beetle. Like, yeah, it's not like specific, so you can really just you can really just interpret it how you want. There's interpretations of him as a beetle. There's interpretations of him as a cockroach. Yeah. I hope that makes sense. But then he said to himself, before it strikes 7:15, I'll definitely have to get properly out of bed. And by then somebody will have come round from work to ask what's happened to me, as well as they open up at work before 7 o'clock. And so he set himself to the task of swinging the entire length of his body out of bed at the same time. If he succeeded in falling out of bed in this way, and kept his head raised as he did, so he could probably avoid injuring it. His back seemed to be quite hard, and probably nothing would happen to it falling onto the carpet. His main concern was for the loud noise he was bound to make, which even through all the doors would probably raise concern, if not alarm. But it was something that had to be risked. When Gregor was already sticking halfway out of the bed, the new method was more of a game than an effort. All he had to do was rock back and forth. It occurred to him how simple everything would be if someone came to help him. Two strong people, he had his father and the maid in mind, would have been more than enough. They would only have to push their arms under the dome of his back, peel him away from the bed, bend down with the load, and then be patient and careful as he swung over onto the floor, where, hopefully, the little legs would find a use. Should he really call for help, though, even apart from the fact that all the doors were locked? Despite all the difficulty he was in, he could not suppress a smile at this thought. After a while, he had already moved so far across that it would be hard for him to keep his balance if he rocked too hard. The time was now 7:10, and he would have to make the final decision very soon. Then there was a ring at the door of the flat. That'll be someone from work, he said to himself, and froze very still, although his little legs only became all the more lively as they danced around. For a moment, everything remained quiet. They're not opening the door, Gregor said to himself, caught in some nonsensical hope. But then, of course, the maid's first steps went to the door as ever and opened it. Gregor only needed to hear the visitor's first words of the greeting, and he knew who it was, the chief clerk himself. Why did Gregor have to be the only one condemned to work for a company where they immediately become highly suspicious at the slightest shortcoming? Were all employees, every one of them, louts? Was there not one of them who was faithful and devoted, who goes so mad with pangs of conscience that he couldn't get out of bed if he didn't spend at least a couple hours morning on company business? Was it really not enough to let one of the trainees make inquiries, assuming inquiries were even necessary? Did the chief clerk have to come himself, and did they have to show the whole innocent family that this was so suspicious that only the chief clerk could be trusted to have the wisdom to investigate it? And more because these thoughts had made him upset than through any proper decision. He swung himself with all the force out of the bed. There was a loud thump, but it wasn't really a loud noise. His fall was softened a little by the carpet, and Gregor's back was also more elastic than he had thought, which made the sound muffled and not too noticeable. He had not held his head carefully enough, though, and hit it as he fell. Annoyed and in pain, he turned it and rubbed it against the carpet. So you can already see that, like, he cares so fucking deeply about his family. He actively gets annoyed when the chief clerk comes in and makes trouble on his behalf because he wasn't at work. "Something's fallen down in there," said the chief clerk in the room of the left. Gregor tried to imagine whether something of the sort that had happened to him today could ever happen to the chief clerk too. You had to concede that it was possible, but as if a gruff reply to this question, the chief clerk's firm footsteps in his highly polished boots could now be heard in the adjoining room. From the room on his right, Gregor's sister whispered to let him know, "Gregor, the chief clerk is here." "Yes, I know," said Gregor to himself, but without daring to raise his voice loud enough for his sister to hear him. "Gregor," said his father from the room to his left, the chief clerk has come round and wants to know why you didn't leave on the early train. We don't know what to say to him, and anyway, he wants to speak to you personally. So please open up this door. I'm sure he'll be good enough to forgive the untidiness of your room." Then the chief clerk called, "Good morning, Mr. Samsa." "He isn't well," said his mother to the chief clerk, while his father continued to speak through the door. "He isn't well, please believe me. Why else would Gregor have missed a train? The lad only ever thinks about business, and nearly makes me cross the way he never goes out in the evenings. He's been in town for a week now, but stayed home every evening. He sits with us in the kitchen and just reads the paper or studies train timetables." His idea of relaxation is working with his fret saw. He's made a little frame, for instance. It only took him 2 or 3 evenings. You'll be amazed how nice it is. It's hanging up in his room. You'll see it as soon as Gregor opens the door. Anyway, I'm glad you're here. We wouldn't have been able to get Gregor to open the door by ourselves. He's so stubborn. And I'm sure he isn't well. He said that this morning that he is, but he isn't. I'll be there in a moment, Gregor slowly and thoughtfully, but without moving so that he would not miss any word of the conversation. Well, I can't think of any other way of explaining it, Mr. Samsa, said the chief clerk. I hope it's nothing serious, but on the other hand, I must say that if we people in commerce ever become slightly unwell, then, fortunately or unfortunately as you like, we simply have to overcome it because of business considerations. Can the chief clerk come in and to see you now, then? Asked his father impatiently, knocking at the door again. No, said Gregor. In the room on his right, there followed a painful silence. In the room on his left, his sister began to cry. So why did his sister not go and join the others? She had probably only just got up and even begun to get dressed. And why was she crying? Was it because he had not got up and had not let the chief clerk in? Because he was in the danger of losing his job, and if that happens, his boss would once more pursue the parents with the same demands as before? There was no need to worry about things like that yet. Gregor was still there and had not the slightest intention of abandoning his family. Gregor! For the time he just lay there on the carpet, and no one who knew the condition he was in would seriously have expected him to let the chief clerk in. It was only a minor discourtesy, and a suitable excuse could easily be found for it later on. Okay. I'm gonna host a straw poll. Because I just had like a fucking brain blast about something I could do. So what I'm thinking, video title, Gregor Samsa, disability, death, and the desire to exist. And disability, death, and the duty. These are like I thought of like duty being more fitting regarding him upon rereading, like seeing like, oh man, yeah, he loves his fucking family. I kind of forget. I don't know why. It's like one of the most important like aspects of the book, but I like low-key kind of forgot that Gregor is like he loves his family. Okay, I'm still seeing and the desire to exist. I know the desire to exist portion goes hard, but like I'm in my mind sphere, I'm thinking like it's less about like a philosophy of desiring to exist. Like that was the stranger. That was the stranger. I think like duty makes more sense, but like, and the desire to exist does like fit like fucking disability, death, and the desire to exist fits more than disability, death, and duty. I don't know. I don't know. I might just keep it as is. I just want no feedback of a thought I had. The chief clerk now raised his voice. Mr. Samsa, he called to him. What's wrong? You barricade yourself in your room, give us no more than yes or no for an answer. You are causing serious and unnecessary concern to your parents, and you fail. And I mention this just by the way. You fail to carry out your business duties in a way that is quite unheard of. I'm speaking here on behalf of your parents and of your employer, and really must request a clear and immediate explanation. I am astonished, quite astonished. I thought I knew you as a calm and sensible person, and now you suddenly seem to be showing off with peculiar whims. This morning your employer did suggest a possible reason for your failure to appear. It's true, it had to do with the money that was recently entrusted to you. But I came near to giving him my word of honor that that could not be the right explanation. But now that I see your incomprehensible stubbornness, I can no longer feel any wish whatsoever to intercede on your behalf, and nor is your position all that secure. I had originally intended to say all this to you in private, but since you caused me to waste my time here for no good reason, I don't see why your parents should not also learn of it. Your turnover has been very unsatisfactory of late. I grant you that it's not the time of year to do especially good business. We recognize that, but there's simply no time of year to do no business at all, Mr. Samsa. We cannot allow there to be. But, sir, called Gregor, beside himself and forgetting all else in the excitement, I'll open up immediately, just a moment. I'm slightly unwell, an attack of dizziness. I haven't been able to get up. I'm still in bed now. I'm quite fresh again now, though. I'm just getting out of bed. Just a moment. Be patient. It's not quite as easy as I thought. I'm quite alright now, though it's shocking what can suddenly happen to a person. I was quite alright last night. My parents know about it, perhaps better than me. I had a small symptom of it last night already. They must have noticed it. I don't know why I didn't let you know at work, but you always think you can't get over an illness without staying at home. Please don't make my parents suffer. There's no basis for any of the accusations you're making. Nobody's ever said a word to me about any of these things. Maybe you haven't read the latest contracts I sent in. I'll set off the 8 o'clock train as well. These few hours of rest has given me strength. You don't need to wait, sir. I'll be in the office soon after you, and please be as good to tell him that to the boss and recommend me to him. And while Gregor gushed out these words, hardly knowing what he was saying, he made his way over to the chest of drawers. This was easily done, probably because of the practice he had already had in bed, where he now tried to get himself upright. He didn't really want to open the door, he really did want to open the door, really did want to let them see him and to speak with the chief clerk. The others were being so insistent, and he was curious to learn what they would say when they caught sight of him. If they were shocked, then it would no longer be Gregor's responsibility and he could rest. If, however, they took everything calmly, he would still have no reason to be upset. And if he hurried, he could really be at the station for 8 o'clock. The first few times he tried to climb up on the smooth chest of drawers, he slid down again, but he finally gave himself one last swing and stood there upright. The lower part of his body was in serious pain, but he no longer gave any attention to it. Now he left himself fall against the back of a nearby chair and held tightly to the edges of it with his little legs. By now, he let himself fall against the back of a nearby... by now, he had also calmed down and kept quiet so that he could listen to what the chief clerk was saying. This is, one of the most heartbreaking parts of the book to me. Sorry. Did you understand a word all of that? The chief clerk asked his parents. Surely he's not trying to make fools of us. Oh God, called his mother, who was already in tears. He could be seriously ill and we're making him suffer. Crete! Crete! She then cried. Mother? His sister called from the other side. They communicated across Gregor's room. You have to go for the doctor straight away. Gregor's ill. Quick, get the doctor. Did you hear the way Gregor spoke just now? That was the voice of an animal, said the chief clerk with a calmness that was in contrast with his mother's screams. Anna! Anna! His father called into the kitchen throughout the entrance hall, clapping his hands. Get a locksmith here now! And then the two girls, their skirts swishing, immediately ran out through the hall, wrenching open the front door of the flat as they went. How had his sister managed to get dressed so quickly? There was no sound of the door banging shut again. They must have left it open. People often do in homes where something awful has happened. That I don't know why that part hits so hard for me. Gregor, in contrast, had become much calmer, so they couldn't understand his words anymore, although they seemed clear enough to him, clearer than before. Perhaps his ears had become used to the sound. They had realized, though, that there was something wrong with him and were ready to help. The first response to the situation had been confident and wise, and that made him feel better. He felt that he had been drawn back in among people, and from the doctor and the locksmith he expected great and surprising achievements, although he did not really distinguish one from the other. Whatever was said next would be crucial, so in order to make his voice clear as possible, he coughed a little, but taking care to do this not too loudly, as even though this might well sound different from the way that a human coughs, and he was no longer sure he could judge this from himself. Meanwhile, it had become very quiet in the next room. Perhaps his parents were sat at the table whispering with the chief clerk, or perhaps they were all pressed against the door and listening. Gregor slowly pushed his way over to the door of the chair. Once he let go of it and threw himself onto the door, holding himself upright against it using the adhesive of the tips of his legs. He rested there a little while to recover from the effort involved and then set himself to the task of turning the key with the lock in the lock of his mouth. He seemed, unfortunately, to have no proper teeth. How was he, then, to grasp the key? But the lack of the teeth was, of course, made up for with a very strong jaw. Using the jaw, he was ready to start the key turning, ignoring the fact that he must have been causing some damage as the brown fluid came from his mouth, flowed over the key and dripped onto the floor. "Listen," said the chief clerk in the next room, "he's turning the key." Gregor was greatly encouraged by this, but they all should have been calling to him his father and mother too. "Well done, Gregor!" they should have cried. "Keep at it! Keep hold of luck!" The idea that they were all excitedly following his efforts, he bit on the key with all his strength, paying no attention to the pain he was causing himself. As the key turned round, he turned around the lock with it, only holding himself upright with his mouth, and hung on to the key or pushed it down with the whole weight of his body as needed. The clear sound of the lock as it snapped back with Gregor's sign that he could break his concentration, and as he regained his breath, he said to himself, "So, I didn't need the locksmith after all." Then he lay on his head on the handle of the door to open it completely. Because he had to open the door this way, it was already wide open before he could be seen. He had first to slowly turn himself around one of the double doors, and he had to do it very carefully if he did not want to fall flat on his back before entering the room. He was still occupied with this difficult movement, unable to pay attention to anything else, when he heard the chief clerk exclaim aloud, "Oh!" which sounded like the soughing of the wind. Now he also saw him. He was nearest to the door, his hand pressed against his open mouth, slowly retreating as if driven by a steady and invisible force. Gregor's mother, her hair still disheveled from bed, despite the chief clerk's being there, looked at his father. Then she unfolded her arms, took 2 steps forward towards Gregor, and sank down to the floor into skirts that spread themselves around her, and her head disappeared down onto her breast. His father looked hostile and clenched his fist as if wanting to knock Gregor back into his room. Then he looked uncertainly around the living room, covered his eyes with his hands, and wept so that his powerful chest shook. So Gregor did not go into the room, but leant against the inside of the other door, which had been bolted in place. It was the only way only half of his body could be seen, along with his head above it, which he leant over to one side as he peered around the other. As he peered at the others. Meanwhile, the day had become much lighter. Part of the endless gray-black building on the other side of the street, which was a hospital, could be seen quite clearly with the austere and regular line of windows piercing its facade. The rain was still falling, now throwing down large individual droplets which hit the ground one at a time. The washing up from breakfast lay on the table. There was so much of it because for Gregor's father, breakfast was the most important meal of the day, and he would stretch it out for several hours as he sat reading a number of different newspapers. On the wall exactly opposite, there were photographs of Gregor when he was a lieutenant in the army. I forgot about that fact. His sword in hand and a carefree smile on his face as he called forth the respect for his uniform and bearing. The door to the entrance hall was open, and as the front door of the flat was also open, he could see onto the landing and the stairs where they began their way down below. "Now then," said Gregor, well aware that he was the only one who kept calm, "I'll get dressed straight away now." Pack up my samples and set off. Will you please just let me leave? You can see, he said to the chief clerk, that I'm not stubborn and I like to do my job, being a commercial traveler and an arduous, but without traveling I couldn't earn my living. So where are you going into the office, he asked. Will you report everything accurately then? It's quite possible for someone to be temporarily unable to work, but that's just the right time to remember what's been achieved in the past and consider that later on, once the difficulty had been removed, you will certainly work with all the more diligence and concentration. You're well aware that I'm seriously in debt to our employer as well as having to look after my parents and sister, so that I'm trapped in a difficult situation, but I will work my way out of it again. Please don't make things any harder for me than they already are, and don't take sides against... I also forgot about the lieutenant part. Honestly, while I read this in school, I don't remember much. Fair enough. Please don't make this any more harder than they are already, and don't take sides against me at the office. I know that nobody likes the travelers. They think we earn an enormous wage as well as having a soft time of it. That's just prejudice, but they have no particular reason to think better it. But sir, you have a better overview than the rest of the staff. In fact, if I can say this in confidence, a better overview than the boss himself. It's very easy for a businessman like him to make mistakes about his employees and judge more harshly than he should, and you're well aware that we travelers spend almost the whole year away from the office, so that we can very easily fall victim to gossip and chance and groundless complaints, and it's almost impossible to defend yourself from that sort of thing. We don't usually even hear about them, or at all, when we arrive back home exhausted from a trip. And that's when we feel the harmful effects of what's going on without even knowing what caused them. Please don't go away. At least first say something to show you grant that I'm at least partly right. But the chief clerk had turned away as soon as Gregor had started to speak, and with protruding lips, only stared back at him over his trembling shoulders as he left. He did not keep still for a moment while Gregor was speaking, but moved steadily toward the door without taking his eyes off him. He moved very gradually, as if there had been some secret prohibition on leaving the room. It was only when he reached the entrance hall that he made a sudden movement, drew his foot from the living room, and rushed forward in a panic. In the hall, he stretched his right hand far out towards the stairway as if out there's some supernatural force waiting to save him. Gregor realized that it was out of the question to let the chief clerk go away in the mood if his position in the firm was not to be put in extreme danger. That was something his parents did not understand very well. Over the years, they had become convinced that his job would provide Gregor for his entire life, and besides, they had so much to worry about at the present that they had lost any sight of any thought for the future. Gregor, though, did think about the future. The chief clerk had to be held back, calmed down, convinced, and finally won over. The future of Gregor and his family depended on it. If only his sister were here. She was clever, she was already in tears while Gregor was still lying peacefully on his back. And the chief clerk was a lover of women. Surely she could persuade him. She would close the front door in the entrance hall and talk him out of his shook state. But his sister was not there. Gregor would have to do the job himself, and without considering that he was still not familiar with how well he could move about in his present state, or that his speech might not, or probably would not, be understood, he let go of the door, pushed himself through the opening, and tried to reach the chief clerk of the landing, who, ridiculously, was holding onto the banister with both hands. But Gregor fell over immediately, and with a little scream as he sought something to hold on to, landing on his numerous little legs. Hardly had that happened, then, for the first time that day, he began to feel alright with his body. The little legs had the solid ground under them. To his pleasure, they did exactly as he told them. They were even making the effort to carry him where he wanted to go. And he was soon believing that all of his sorrows would soon finally be at an end. He held back the urge to move, but swayed from side to side as he crouched there on the floor. His mother was not far away in front of him and seemed at first quite engrossed in herself. But then she suddenly jumped up with her arms outstretched and her fingers spread, shouting, "Help! For pity's sake, help!" The way she held her head suggested she wanted to see Gregor better, but the unthinking way she was hurrying backwards showed that she did not. She had forgotten that the table was behind her with all the breakfast things on it. When she reached the table, she sat quickly down at it without knowing what she was doing, even seeming to notice that the coffee pot had been knocked over and a gush of coffee was pouring down the carpet. Mother, Gregor said gently. Mother, Gregor said gently, looking up at her. He had completely forgotten the chief clerk for the moment, but could not help himself snapping in the air with his jaws at the sight of the flow of coffee. That set his mother screaming anew. She fled from the table and into the arms of her father as he rushed towards her. Gregor, though, had no time to spare for his parents now. The chief clerk had already reached the stairs with his chin on the banister. He looked back for the last time. Gregor made a run for him. He wanted to be sure of reaching him. The chief clerk must have expected something as he leapt down several steps at once and disappeared, his shouts resounding all around the staircase. The flight of the chief clerk seemed, unfortunately, to put Gregor's father into panic as well. Until then, he had been relatively self-controlled, but now, instead of running after the clerk himself, or at least not impeding Gregor as he ran after him, Gregor's father seized the chief clerk's stick in his right hand. The chief clerk had left it in behind on the chair along with his hat and overcoat, picked up a large newspaper from the table to his left, and used them to drive Gregor back into his room, stamping his foot at him as he went. Gregor's appeals to his father were of no help. His appeals were simply not understood. However much he humbly turned his head, his father merely stamped his foot all the harder. Across the room, despite the chilly weather, Gregor's mother had pulled open a window, leaned far out of it, and pressed her hands to her face. A strong draught of air flew in from the street towards the stairway. The curtains flew up, the newspapers on the table fluttered, and some of them were blown onto the floor. Nothing would stop Gregor's father as he drove him back, making hissing noises at him like a wild man. Gregor had never had any practice in moving backwards and was only able to go very slowly. If Gregor had only been allowed to turn around, he would have been back in his room straight away. But he was afraid that if he took time to do it, that his father would become impatient, and there was the threat of a lethal blow to his back or head that could, from the stick in his father's hand at any moment. Eventually, though, Gregor realized that he had no choice as he saw, to his disgust, that he was incapable of going backwards in a straight line, so he began as quickly as possible and with frequent anxious glances at his father to turn himself around. It went very slowly, but perhaps his father was able to see his good intentions as he did nothing to hinder him. In fact, now and then he used the tip of his stick to give directions from a distance as to which way to turn. If only his father would stop that unbearable hissing. It was making Gregor quite confused. When he had nearly finished turning around, was still listening to hissing, he made a mistake and turned himself back a little the way he came. He was pleased when he finally had his head in the front of the doorway, but when he saw that it was too narrow and his body was too broad to get through without further difficulty. In his present mood, it obviously did not occur to his father to open the door of the double doors so that Gregor would have enough space to get through. He was merely fixed on the idea that Gregor should go back to his room as quickly as possible. Nor would he ever allow Gregor the time to get himself upright as preparation for getting through the doorway. What he did, making more noise than ever, was to drive Gregor forwards all the harder as if there had been nothing in the way. It sounded to Gregor as if there were now more than one father behind him. It was not a pleasant experience, and Gregor pushed himself into the doorway without regard for what might happen. One side of his body lifted itself. He lay at an angle in the doorway, one flank scraped on the white door, and was painfully injured, leaving vile brown flecks on it. Soon he was all stuck fast, and he would not... Soon he was stuck fast and would not have been able to move at all by himself. The little legs along one side hung quivering in the air, while those other side were pressed painfully against the ground. Then his father gave him a hefty shove from behind, which released him from where he was and sent him flying. And heavily bleeding deep into his room, the door was slammed shut with a stick, and finally, all was quiet. I gotta check on my dogs and use the bathroom, so I'm gonna say 5-minute break. Sorry, everybody. I'm gonna. I've decided for this stream, I'm gonna like just have Limbus Company on the side. So if I ever need a break, I can like do like a quick. Oh man. Hold on. Sorry. Give me a sec. Let me make sure I claim all this shit too. Sorry everybody, just give me a sec. Friends Kafka mentioned, yeah. Ignore this, ignore this. I'm just gonna have this set up in the back. I gotta think. I could have Hey Show Cliff, nah. I'll get back to reading. I swear, trust. I will get back to reading. Don't even trip, dog. I'll get back to reading. Hey, now that we're in the topic of it, the way Gregor talks in this ID specifically reminds me a lot. I was reading more like 20 minutes ago, and this shit got on my feed. Yeah, they're YouTube's trying to control you. This is like the thing I thought of. Let's do like 10 consecutive battles. That would be kind of fun. Anyways, I'm just gonna have that in the back. And if I ever, I'm gonna say like, I'm gonna do like a page and then a turn. That would be really funny. It was not until it was getting dark that that Gregor awoke from his deep and coma-like sleep. He would have woken soon afterwards anyway, even if he hadn't been disturbed, as he had enough sleep and felt fully rested. But he had the impression that some hurried steps and the sound of the door leading into the front room being carefully shut had woken him. The light from the electric street lamp shone palely here and there onto the ceiling and the tops of furniture, but down below where Gregor was, it was dark. He pushed himself over to the door, feeling his way clumsily with his antenna, of which he was now beginning to learn the value in order to see what had been happening there. The whole of his left side seemed like one painfully stretched scar, and he had limped badly on his 2 rows of legs. One of the legs had been badly injured in the events of that morning. It was nearly a miracle that only one of them had been and dragged along lifelessly. It was only when he had reached the door that he had realized what had actually had drawn him over to it. It was the smell of something to eat. By the door there was a dish filled with sweet milk with little pieces of white bread floating in it. He was so pleased he had almost laughed, as he was even hungrier than he had been in the morning. And he dipped his head into the milk, nearly covering his eyes with it, but he soon drew his head back again in disappointment. Not only did the pain in his tender left side make it difficult to eat the food, he was only able to eat if his whole body worked together as a snuffing whole, but the milk did not taste at all nice. Okay. Anyways, turn 1. This is like a ridiculously good turn 1. For private resources. Okay, you know what? This might actually get annoying, so let's do like 2 pages for a turn.
알고 있겠지. 예측은 의미 없다는 거. 마침내 끊어냈나. Oh, oops. I accidentally did a turn. I didn't mean that. Not even trying to troll. Okay. We'll get back to it. I don't want to interrupt the story too much. Just because I want to have fun. Good shit, Gregor. Let me set up this turn, and we will go straight to it. Alright. Anyways. Milk like this was normally his favorite drink, and his sister had certainly left there for him because of that. But he turned almost against his own will away from the dish and crawled back into the center of the room. Through the crack in the door, Gregor could see that the gas had been lit in the living room. His father at the time would normally be sat with his evening paper and reading out in a loud voice to Gregor's mother, and sometimes to his sister, but there was now not a sound to be heard. Gregor's sister would often write and tell him about this reading, but maybe his father had lost the habit in recent times. It was so quiet all around too, even though there must have been somebody in the flat. What a quiet life it is the family lead, said Gregor to himself, and gazing into the darkness, felt a great pride that he was able to provide a life like that in such a nice home for his sister and parents. But what now if all this peace and wealth and comfort should come to a horrible and frightening end? There's something that Gregor did not want to think about too much, so he started to move about, crawling up and down the room. Once during that long evening, the door on one side of the room was opened very slowly and hurriedly closed again. Later on, the door on the other side did the same. It seemed that someone needed to enter a room, but thought better of it. Gregor went and waited immediately by the door, resolved to either bring the timorous visitor into the room. Okay, I need to... Okay, sorry. My phone fucking dropped out of my pocket. I need to put it on my table. Anyways. Gregor went and waited immediately by the door, resolved either to bring the timorous visitor into the room in some way, or at least find out who it was, but the door was open no more than night, and Gregor waited in vain. The previous morning, while doors were locked, everyone had wanted to get in there to him, but now that he had opened up one of the doors and the other had clearly been unlocked sometime during the day, no one came, and the keys were on the other side. Okay.
그래, 내가 왔다.
Nice one. You will be boiled.
앞을 밝히자. 그래야 다시 잘 보이도록. 완전 여유탄 횟수.
숨막히도록 견뎌왔고 절박하게 갈망했으니 헤아릴 수 없이 저주했으니.
I didn't know the book came with this cool video game. I explained what I'm doing like 5 times. Please God. Alright. Do this. Alright. Anyways, let's get back to it.
It was not until late at night that the gaslight in the living room was put out, and now it was easy to see that the parents and sister had stayed awake all that time, as they could be distinctly heard as they went away together on tiptoe. It was clear that no one would come into Gregor's room anymore until morning, and that gave him plenty of time to think undisturbed about how he would have to rearrange his life. For some reason, the tall, empty room where he was forced to remain made him feel uneasy as he lay there flat on the floor, even though he had been living in it for 5 years. Hardly aware of what he was doing other than the slight feeling of shame, he hurried under the couch, pressed down his back a little, and he was no longer able to lift his head. But he nonetheless felt immediately at ease, as his only regret was that his body was too broad to get it all underneath. He spent the whole night there. Some of the time he passed in a light sleep, although he frequently woke from it in alarm because of his hunger, and some of the time was spent in worries and vague hopes, which, however, always had led to the same conclusion. For the time being, he must remain calm. He must show patience and the greatest consideration so that his family could bear the unpleasantness that he, in his present condition, was forced to impose on them. Jesus fucking Christ. Oh, I forgot how hard this hits when you look at it through the lens of, instead of a big bug guy, he's a disabled. He views himself as a nuisance, he views himself as unpleasant. And his family, who's not, ready to assist him. God, that's fucked. That's awful. Anyways, Gregor soon had the opportunity to test the strength of his decisions, as early next morning, almost before the night had ended, his sister, nearly fully dressed, opened the door from the front room and looked anxiously in. She did not see him straight away, but when she did notice him under the couch, he had to be somewhere, for God's sake. He couldn't have flown away. She was so shocked that she lost control of herself and slammed the door shut again from the outside. But she seemed to regret her behavior, as she opened the door again straight away and came in on tiptoe, as if entering the room of someone seriously ill, or even of a stranger. Gregor had pushed his head forward right to the edge of the couch and watched her. When she noticed that he had left the milk as it was, realized that it was not from any lack of hunger, and bring him in some other food that was more suitable. If she didn't do it herself, he would rather go hungry than draw her attention to it. Although he did feel a terrible urge to rush forward from under the couch, throw himself at his sister's feet, and beg her for something good to eat. However, his sister noticed the full dish immediately and looked at it, and the few drops of milk splashed around it with some surprise. She immediately picked it up, using a rag not her bare hands, and carried it out. Gregor was extremely curious as to what she would bring in its place, imagining the wildest possibilities, but he never could have guessed what his dear sister and her goodness actually did bring. In order to test his taste, she brought him a whole selection of things, all spread out on an old newspaper. There's old half-rotten vegetables, bones from the evening meal, covered in white sauce that had gone hard, a few raisins and almonds, some cheese that Gregor had declared inedible 2 days before, a dry roll and some bread spread with butter and salt, as well as that she had poured some water into the dish, which had probably been permanently set aside for Gregor's use, and placed it beside them. Then, out of consideration for Gregor's feelings, as she knew that he would not eat in front of her, she hurried out again and even turned the key in the lock so that Gregor would know he could make things as comfortable for himself as he liked. Gregor's little legs whirred as at last he could eat. What's more, his injuries must already have completely healed, as he found no difficulty in moving. This amazed him, as more than a month earlier he had cut his finger slightly with a knife. He thought of how his finger had still hurt the day before yesterday. Am I less sensitive than I used to be then? He thought. Though from more personal experience, the aspect of you realizing that your state isn't normal also can hit hard. I have been visually impaired all my life, and knowing things other can do and I can't, simply because of my eyesight, hurts sometimes and makes me very annoyed in other places. That I can completely understand. I don't wish to speak on what I have, but I want to know I emphasize a few, and I'm thankful you shared your experience. Am I less sensitive than I used to be then? He thought, and was already sucking greedily at the cheese, which he had immediately, almost compellingly, attracted him much more than the other foods on the newspaper. Quickly, one after another, his eyes watering with pleasure, he consumed the cheese The vegetables and the sauce, the fresh foods on the other hand, he didn't like at all, and even dragged the things he didn't want to eat a little way from them because he couldn't stand the smell. I appreciate the other guys spamming emojis in the comments. That really amazing to know someone else is also out there clicking that button. Oh, is that like the YouTube mobile thing? I can't see that on my end. Long after he had finished eating and lay lethargic in the same place, his sister slowly turned the key in the lock as a sign to him that he should withdraw. He was immediately startled, although he had been half asleep, and he hurried under the couch. But he needed great self-control to stay there even for a short time that his sister was in the room, as eating so much food had rounded out his body a little, and he could hardly breathe in that narrow space. Half suffocating, he watched with bulging eyes as his sister, unself-consciously, took a broom and swept up the leftovers, mixing them in with the food he had not even touched at all, as if it could not be used anymore. She quickly dropped it all into a bin, closed it with its wooden lid, and carried everything out. She had hardly turned her back before Gregor came out again from the couch and stretched himself. This is how Gregor received his food each day now. Once in the morning while his parents and the maid were still asleep, and the second time after everyone had eaten their meal at midday, as his parents would sleep for a little while then as well, and Gregor's sister would send the maid on the way on some errand. Gregor's father and mother certainly did not want him to starve either, but perhaps it would have been more than they could stand to have any more experience of his feeding than being told about it. And perhaps his sister wanted to spare them with what distress she could, as they were indeed suffering enough.
예측할 수
이
없게
순간이 다하도록 베어내리라.
I love this book.
예측 그럼
It's good.
몰아치는 처절한 원망. 베어내리라.
본인은
There we go.
최선을 다했다고.
어쩌네. 살려주지.
Alright, now the burn team is set up.
해고 감독. 증폭.
베어내리라. 원망과 이 순간이 다하도록 베어내리라. 원망도 옅어지나.
Alright. I'm gonna do one more turn, and then we'll get straight back to it, I promise.
단번에
이
끝낸다.
순간이 다하도록 베어내리라. 격발.
대상 확. 철침탄. 트랜지션. 확산탄. 임상시험 성공. 여유 탄환수.
원망도 옅어지나. 낮도 밤도 지 숨이 닿도록 베어낼 뿐. 낮도 밤도 지 숨이 닿도록 베어낼 뿐.
Alright. Let's get back to it. It was impossible for Gregor to find out what they had told the doctor and locksmith that first morning to get them out of the flat, as nobody could understand him. Nobody, not even his sister, thought that he could understand them, so he had to be content to hear his sister's sighs and appeals to the saints as she moved about his room. It was only later, when she had become a little more used to everything, there was, of course, no question of her ever becoming fully used to the situation, that Gregor would sometimes catch a friendly little comment. Or at least a comment that could have been true friendly. He enjoyed his dinner today, she might say, when he had diligently cleared away all the food left for him, or if he left most of it, which she slowly became more and more frequent. She would often say sadly, "Now everything's just been left there again." Although Gregor wasn't able to hear any news directly, he did listen to much of what was said in the next rooms, and whenever he heard anyone speaking, he would scurry straight to the appropriate door and press his whole body against it. There was seldom any conversation, especially at first, that was not about him in some way, even if in secret. For 2 whole days, all the talk at every mealtime was about what they should do now, but even between meals, they spoke about the same subject as there was always at least 2 members of the family at home. Nobody wanted to be at home by themselves, and it was out of the question to leave the flat entirely empty. And on the very first day, the maid had fallen to her knees and begged Gregor's mother to let her go without delay. It was not very clear how much she knew of what had happened, but she had left within a quarter of an hour, cheerfully thanking Gregor's mother for her dismissal as if she'd done her an enormous service. She even swore empathetically not to tell anyone the slightest about what had happened, even though no one had asked that of her. Now Gregor's sister also had to help his mother with the cooking. Although that was not so much a bother as no one ate very much, Gregor often heard how one of them would unsuccessfully urge another to eat, and receive no more answer than a "no thanks, I've had enough," or something similar. No one drank very much either. His sister would sometimes ask his father whether he would like a beer, hoping for the chance to go and fetch it herself. When his father then said nothing, she would add, so that he would not feel selfish, that she could send the housekeeper for it, but then his father would close the matter with a big loud "no!" and nothing more would be said. No! And nothing more would be said. Even before the first day had come to an end, his father had explained to Gregor's mother and sister what their finances and prospects were. Now and then he stood up from the table and took some receipt or document from the little cash box he saved from his business when it had collapsed 5 years earlier. Gregor heard how he opened the complicated lock and then closed it again after he had taken away the item he wanted. What he heard his father say was some of the first good news that Gregor had heard since he had first been incarcerated in his room. He had thought that nothing at all remained from his father's business, at least he had never told him anything different, and Gregor had never asked him about it anyway. Their business misfortune had reduced the family to a state of total despair, and Gregor's only concern at the time had been to arrange things so that they could all forget about it as quickly as possible. So then he started working especially hard with a fiery vigor that raised him from a junior salesman to a traveling representative almost overnight. Bringing with it the chance to earn money in quite different ways, Gregor converted his success at work straight into cash that he could lay on the table at the home for the benefit of his astonished and delighted family. They had been good times, and they had never come again. At least not with the same splendor, even though Gregor had later earned so much that he was in the position to bear the cost of the whole family, and did bear them. They had even gotten used to it. Both Gregor and the family, they took the money with gratitude, and he was glad to provide it. Although there was no longer much warm affection given in return, Gregor only remained close to his sister now. Unlike him, she was very fond of music and gifted and expressive violinist. It was a secret plan to send her to the conservatory next year, even though it cost a great expense that would have to be made up for in some other way. During Gregor's short periods in town, conversation with his sister would often turn to conservatory, but it was only ever mentioned as a lovely dream that could never be realized. Their parents did not like to hear this innocent talk, but Gregor thought about it quite hard and decided he would let them know what he planned with a grand announcement of it on Christmas Day. That was a sort of the totally pointless thing that went through his mind in this present state, pressed upright against the door and listening. There were times when he simply became too tired to continue listening, when his head would fall wearily against the door. Sorry. When his head would fall wearily against the door, and he would pull it up again with a start, as even the slightest noise he would cause would be heard next door, and they would all go silent. "What's that he's doing now?" his father would say after a while, clearing have gone over to the door, and only then would the interrupted conversation slowly be taken up again. When explaining things, his father repeated himself several times, partly because it was a long time since he had been occupied with these matters himself, and partly because Gregor's mother did not understand everything at the first time. For these repeated explanations, Gregor learned to his pleasure that despite all of their misfortune, there was still some money available from the old days. It was not a lot, but it had not been touched in the meantime, and had some interest it had accumulated. Besides that, they had not been using up all the money that Gregor had been bringing home every month, keeping only a little for himself, so that too had been accumulating. Behind the door, Gregor nodded with enthusiasm and pleasure at this unexpected thrift and caution.
could actually have used this surplus money to reduce his father's debt to his boss, and then when he could have freed himself from the job would have come much closer. But now it was certainly better the way his father had done things. This money, however, was certainly not enough to enable the family to live off the interest. It was enough to maintain them for perhaps 1 or 2 years, no more. That's to say, it was money that should not really be touched but set aside for emergencies. Money to live on had to be earned. His father was healthy but old and lacking in self-confidence during the 5 years that he had not been working, the first holiday in a life that had been full of strain and no success. He had put on a lot of weight and became very slow and clumsy. Would Gregor's elderly mother now have to go and earn money? She suffered from asthma, and it was strange for her just to move about the home. Every other day would be spent struggling for breath on the sofa by an open window. Would his sister have to go and earn money? She was still a child of 17. Her life up till then had been very enviable, consisting of wearing nice clothes, sleeping late, helping out in the business, joining in with a few modest pleasures, and most of all, playing the violin. Whenever they began to talk of the need to earn money, Gregor would always first let go of the door and then throw himself onto the cool leather sofa next to it, as he became quite hot with shame and regret. He would often lie there the whole night through, not sleeping a wink but scratching at the leather for hours on end. Or he might go to all the effort of pushing a chair to the window, climbing up onto the sill and propped up in the chair, leaning on the window to stare out of it. He used to feel a great sense of freedom from doing this, but doing it now was obviously something more remembered than experienced, as what he actually saw in this way was becoming less distinct every day. Even the things that were quite near, he had used to curse the ever-present view of the hospital across the street, but now he could not see it at all. And if he had not known that he lived in Charlottenstrasse, I hope I pronounced that right, which was a quiet street despite being in the middle of the city, he could have thought that he was looking out the window at a barren waste where the gray sky and the gray earth mingled inseparably. His observant sister only needed to notice the chair twice before she would always push it back to exact position by the window after she tidied up the room, and even left the inner pane of the window open from then on. If Gregor had only been able to speak to his sister and thank her for all that she had to do for him, it would have been easier for him to bear it. But as it would cause him pain, his sister naturally tried as far as possible to pretend there was nothing burdensome about it. And the longer it went on, of course, the better she was able to do so. But as the time went by, Gregor was also able to see through it all the much better. It had become very unpleasant for him now whenever she entered the room. No sooner had she come in than she would quickly close the door as a precaution so that no one would have to suffer the view into Gregor's room. Then she would go straight to the window and pull it hurriedly open, almost as if she were suffocating. Even if it was cold, she would stay at the window breathing deeply for a little while. She would alarm Greg twice a day with this running about and noise making. He would stay under the couch shivering the whole while, knowing full well that she would certainly have liked to spare him this ordeal, but it was impossible for her to be in the same room with him with the open windows closed. Okay. Please stop running and do be seated. Oh, this. Your tranquility.
그래.
Snacking while listening to an audiobook is almost always a good time. Yeah, it's pretty cool. I'm just doing a turn or two after like every major passage.
이쪽으로 와. 내가 안전하게 지켜줄 테니까. 그래. 내가 왔다.
가볍게 제 소나를 확인.
이 순간이 다 되어내리라. 원망도 옅어지나.
Okay. Anywho, back to it. One day, about a month after Gregor's transformation, when his sister no longer had any particular reason to be shocked at his appearance, she came into the room a little earlier than usual and found him still staring out the window, motionless, and just where he would be the most horrible. In itself, his sister not coming into the room would have been no surprise for Gregor, as it would have been difficult for her to immediately open the window while he was still there. But not only did she come in, she went straight back and closed the door behind her. A stranger would have thought he had threatened her and tried to bite her. Gregor went straight to hide himself under the couch, of course, but he had to wait until midday before his sister came back, and she seemed much more uneasy than usual. It made him realize that she still found his appearance unbearable, and would continue to do so. She probably even had to overcome the urge to flee when she saw the little bit of him that protruded from under the couch. One day, in order to spare her even this sight, he spent 4 hours carrying the bedsheet over to the couch on his back, and arranged it so that he would be completely covered and his sister would not be able to see him even if she bent down. If she did not think the sheet was necessary, then all she had to do was take it off again, as it was clear enough that it was no pleasure for Gregor to cut himself off so completely. She left the sheet where it was. Gregor even thought he glimpsed a look of gratitude one time when he carefully looked out from under the sheet to see his sister like the new arrangement. For the first 14 days, Gregor's parents could not bring themselves to come into the room to see him. He would often hear them say how they all appreciated all the new work his sister was doing, even though before they had seen her as the girl who was somewhat useless and frequently be annoyed with her. But now the two of them, father and mother, would often both wait outside the door of Gregor's room while the sister tidied up in there, and as soon as she went again, she would have to tell them exactly how everything looked, what Gregor had eaten, how he had behaved this time, and whether perhaps any slight improvement could be seen. His mother also wanted to go in and visit Gregor relatively soon, but his father and sister at first persuaded her against it. Gregor listened very closely to all this and improved fully. Later, though, she had to be held back by force, which made her call out, "Let me go and see Gregor. He is my unfortunate son. Can't you understand I have to see him?" And Gregor would think to himself that maybe it would be better if his mother came in. Not every day, of course, but one day a week, perhaps. She could understand everything much better than his sister, who, for all her courage, was still just a child after all, and really might not have had an adult's appreciation of the burdensome job she had taken on. Gregor's wish to see his mother was soon realized. Out of consideration for his parents, Gregor wanted to avoid being seen at the window during the day. The few square meters of the floor did not give him much room to crawl about. It was hard to just fly quietly through the night. His food and students stopped giving him any pleasure at all, and so, to entertain himself, he got into the habit of crawling up and down the walls and ceiling. He was especially fond of hanging from the ceiling. It was quite different from lying on the floor. He could breathe more freely, his body had a light swing to it, and up there, relaxed and almost happy, it might happen that he would surprise him even himself by letting go of the ceiling and landing on the floor of a crash. But now, of course, he had far better control of his body than before, and even with a fall as great as that, caused himself no damage. Very soon, his sister had noticed Gregor's new way of entertaining himself. He had, after all, left traces of the adhesive from his feet as he crawled about, and got it into her head to make it as easy as possible for him by removing the furniture that got in his way, especially the chest of the drawers in the desk. Now, this was not something that she would be able to do by herself. She did not dare to ask help from her father. The 16-year-old maid had carried on bravely since the cook had left, but she certainly would not have helped in this. She had even asked to be allowed to keep the kitchen locked at all times and never to have opened the door unless it was especially important. So his sister had no choice but to choose some time when Gregor's father was not there and fetch his mother to help her. As she approached the room, Gregor could hear his mother's express her joy, but once at the door, she went silent. First, of course, his sister came in and she looked around to see everything in the room was alright, and only then did she let her mother enter. Gregor had to hurriedly pull the sheet down lower over the couch and put more folds into it so that everything really looked as if it had just been thrown down by chance. Gregor also refrained this time from spying out from under the sheet. He gave up the chance to see his mother until later and was simply glad that she had come. "You can come in. He can't be seen," his sister obviously leading her in by the hand. The old chest of drawers was too heavy for a pair of feeble women to be heaving about, but Gregor listened as they pushed it from its place, his sister always taking on the heaviest part of the work for herself and ignoring her mother's warnings that she would strain herself. This lasted a very long time. After laboring at it for 15 minutes or more, his mother said it would be better to leave the chest where it was. For one thing, it was too heavy for them to get finished before Gregor's father got home, and leaving it in the middle of the room, it would be in his way even more. And for another thing, it wasn't even sure that taking the furniture away would really be any help to him. She just thought just the opposite. The sight of bare walls saddened her right to her heart, and why wouldn't Gregor feel the same way about it? He'd been using this furniture in his room for a long time, and it would make him feel abandoned to be in an empty room like that. Then quietly, almost whispering as if wanting Gregor, whose whereabouts she didn't know, to hear, not even the tone of her voice, as she was convinced that he did not understand any words, she added, and by taking the furniture away, when it seemed like we're showing that we've given up all hope of improvement, and that we're abandoning to cope for himself, I think it's best to leave this room exactly the way it was, so that when Gregor comes back to us again, he'll find everything unchanged, and he'll be able to forget the time in between all the easier. Hearing these words from his mother made Gregor realize that the lack of any direct human communication, along with the monotonous life led by the family during these 2 months, must have made him confused. He could think of no other way of explaining to himself why he had seriously wanted his room emptied out. Had he really wanted to transform his room into a cave, a warm room fitted out with nice furniture he had inherited? That would have let him crawl around and impede in any direction, but it would also let him quickly forget his past, wondering he still had been human. He had come very close to forgetting, and it had only been the voice of his mother unheard for so long that had shaken him out of it. Nothing should be removed. Everything had to stay. He could not do without the good influence the furniture had on his condition, and if the furniture made it difficult on him to crawl about mindlessly, that was not a loss but a great advantage. His sister, unfortunately, did not agree. She had become used to the idea, not without reason, that she was Gregor's spokesman to his parents about the things that concerned him. This meant that his mother's advice now was sufficient reasoning for her to insist on removing not only the chest of drawers and the desk, as she had thought at first, but all the furniture apart from the all-important couch. It was more childish perversity, of course, or the unexpected confidence she had recently acquired, that made her insist. She had indeed noticed that Gregor needed a lot of room to crawl about in, whereas the furniture, as far as anyone could see, was of no use to him at all. Girls of that age, though, do become enthusiastic about things and feel they must get their way whenever they can. Perhaps this was what tempted Grete to make Gregor's situation seem even more shocking than it was, so she could do even more for him. Grete would probably be the only one who would dare enter a room dominated by Gregor crawling around about the bare walls by himself. So she refused to let her mother dissuade her. Gregor's mother already looking uneasy in his room, she soon stopped speaking and helped Gregor's sister to get the chest of drawers out with what strength she had. The chest of drawers was something that Gregor could do without if he had to, but the writing desk had to stay. Hardly the two women pushed the chest of drawers, groaning, out of the room. Then Gregor poked his head out from under the couch to see what he could do about it. He meant to be careful and considerate as he could, but unfortunately it was his mother who came back first, while Grete in the next room had her arms around the chest, pulling and pushing it from side to side, by herself without it, of course, moving in an inch. His mother was not used to the sight of Gregor. He might have made her ill, so Gregor hurried back towards the far end of the couch. In his startlement, though, he was not able to prevent the sheet at its front from moving a little. It was enough to attract his mother's attention. She stood very still, remained there a moment, and then went back out to Grete. Gregor kept trying to assure himself that nothing unusual was happening. It was just a few pieces of furniture being moved after all, but he soon had to admit that the woman going to and fro but he soon to admit that the woman going to and fro, the little calls to each other, the scraping on the furniture on the floor, all these things made him feel as if he were being assailed from all sides. With his head and legs pulled in against him and his body pressed to the floor, he was forced to admit to himself that he could not stand all of this much longer. They were emptying his room out, taking away everything that was dear to him. They had already taken out the chest containing his pretzel and other tools. Now they threatened to remove his writing desk with its place clearly worn into the floor, the desk where he had done his homework as a business trainee at high school, even while he had been at infant school. He really could not wait any longer to see whether the two women's intentions were good. He had nearly forgotten they were there anyway, as they now were too tired to say anything while they worked, as they could only hear their feet as they stepped heavily out of the door. So, while the women were leant against the desk in the other room catching their breath,
He sallied out, changing direction 4 times, not knowing what he should say first before his attention was suddenly caught by the picture on the wall, which was already denuded, everything else that had been on it, of the lady dressed in copious fur. He'd hurried onto the picture and pressed himself against his glass. It held firmly and focused on his hot belly. This picture, at least now totally covered by Gregor, would certainly be taken away by no one. He turned his head to face the door into the living room so that he could watch the women when they came back. They had not allowed themselves a long rest and came back quite soon. Grady had put an arm around her mother and was nearly carrying her. "What shall we take now, then?" said Grady, and looked around. Her eyes met those of Gregor on the wall. Perhaps only because her mother was there, she remained calm, bent her face to her so that she would not look around, and said, albeit hurriedly, "Come on, let's go back in the living room for a while." Gregor could see what Grady had in mind. She wanted to take her mother somewhere safe and then chase him down from the wall. Well, she could certainly try it. He sat unyielding on his picture. He would rather jump at Grady's face. But Grady's words had made her mother quite worried. She stepped to one side, saw the enormous brown patch against the flowers on the wallpaper, and before she even realized it was Gregor that she saw, screamed, "Oh God, oh God!" Arms outstretched, she fell into the couch as if she had been given up everything and stayed there immobile. "Gregor!" shouted his sister, glowering at him and shaking her fist. This was the first word she had spoken to him directly since his transformation. She ran into the other room to fetch some kind of smelling salts to bring her mother out of her faint. Gregor wanted help too. He could save this picture later, although he stuck fast to the glass and had to pull himself up by force. Then he too ran into the next room as if he could advise his sister, like in the old days, but he had to just stand behind her, do nothing. She's looking into various bottles. He startled her when she turned around. A bottle fell to the ground and broke. A splinter cut Gregor's face. Some kind of caustic medicine splashed all over him. Now, without delaying any longer, Grady took all the bottles she could and ran with them into her mother. She slammed the door shut with her foot, so now Gregor was shut out from his mother, who, because of him, might be near to death. He could not open the door if he did not want to chase his sister away. And she had to stay with his mother. There was nothing from him to do but wait. An oppressive anxiety and self-reproach. He began to crawl about. He crawled over everything, walls, furniture, ceiling, and finally in his confusion, as the whole room began to spin around him, he fell down into the middle of the dinner table. He lay down there for a while, numb and immobile. All around him it was quiet. Maybe that was a good sign. Then there was someone at the door. The maid, of course, had locked herself in the kitchen so that Grady would have to go and answer it. His father had arrived home. "What's happened?" were his first words. Grady's appearance must have made everything clear to him. She answered him with a subdued voice and openly pressed her face into his chest. "Mother's fainted, but she's better now." Gregor got out. "Just as I suspected," said his father. "Just as I always said, but you woman wouldn't listen, would you?" It's clear that to Gregor that Grady had not said enough and that his father took it to mean that something bad had happened, that he was responsible for some act of violence. That meant Gregor would now have to try to calm his father, as he did not have the time to explain things to him, even if that had been possible. So he fled to the door of his room and he pressed himself against it so that his father, when he came in from the hall, could see straight away that Gregor had best intentions and would go back into his room without delay. That it would not be necessary to drive him back, but they had only to open the door and he would disappear. His father, though, was not in the mood to notice solitudes like that. "Ah!" he shouted as he came in, sounding as if he were both angry and glad at the same time. Gregor drew his head back from the door and lifted it toward his father. He really had not imagined his father the way he stood there now. Of late, with his new habit of crawling about, he had neglected to pay attention to what was going on the rest of the flat the way he had done before. He really ought to have expected things to have changed, but still, was that really his father? Same tired man as used to be laying there, entombed in his bed when Gregor came back from business trips, would receive him sitting in the armchair in his nightgown when he came back in the evenings, who was hardly even able to stand up as a sign of pleasure, would raise his arms, and who, on the couple of times a year, when they went for a walk together on a Sunday or a public holiday, wrapped up tightly in his overcoat between Gregor and his mother, would always labor his way forward a little slowly, and then them, or are you walking slowly for their sake? Who would place his stick down carefully if he wanted to say something, would invariably stop and gather his companions around him. He was standing up straight enough now, dressed in a smart blue uniform with gold buttons, sort worn by employees at a banking institute. Above the high, stiff collar of the coat, his strong double chin emerged. Under the bushy eyebrows, his piercing dark eyes looked out fresh and alert. His normally unkempt white hair was combed painfully close to his scalp.
He took his cap with its gold monogram on, probably from some bank, and threw it in the arc across the room onto the sofa. Put his hands in his trouser pockets, pushing the back and bottom of his long uniform coat, and with a look of determination walked towards Gregor. He probably did not even know himself what he had in mind, but nonetheless lifted his feet unusually high. Gregor was amazed at the enormous size of the soles of his boots, but wasted no time with that. He knew full well, right from the first day of his new life, that his father thought it was necessary to always be extremely strict with him. And so he ran up to his father, stopped when his father stopped, scurried forward again when he moved, even slightly. In this way, they went around the room several times without anything decisive happening, without even giving the impression of a chance of everything went so slowly. Impression of a chase as everything went so slowly. Gregor remained all this time on the floor, largely because he feared his father might see it as especially provoking if he fled onto the wall or ceiling. Whatever he did, Gregor had to admit that he was certainly not able to keep up this running about for long, as for each step his father took he had to carry out countless movements. He became noticeably short of breath. Even in his earlier life, his lungs had not been very reliable. Now, as he lurched about in his efforts to muster all the strength he could for running, he could hardly keep his eyes open. His thoughts became too slow to him to think of any other way of saving himself than running. He almost forgot that the walls were there for him to use, although here they were concealed behind carefully carved furniture full of notches and protrusions. Right there beside him, lightly tossed, something flew down and rolled in front of him. It was an apple. Then another one immediately flew at him. Gregor froze in shock. There was no longer any point in running as his father decided to bombard him. He had filled his pockets with the fruit from the bowl on the sideboard and now, without even taking the time for careful aim, threw one apple after another. These little red apples rolled about on the floor, knocking into each other as if they had electric motors. An apple thrown without much force glanced against Gregor's back and slid off without doing any harm. Another one, however, immediately following it, hit squarely and lodged in his back. Gregor wanted to drag himself away, as if he could remove the incredible pain by changing his position, but he felt as if it nailed to the spot and spread himself out, all his senses in confusion. The last thing he saw of his room being pulled open, his sister was screaming. His mother ran out in front of her in her blouse, as his sister had taken off some of her clothes after she had fainted to make sure it was easier for her to breathe. She ran to his father, her skirts unfastened and sliding one after the other into the ground. Stumbling over the skirts, she pushed herself to his father, her arms around him, uniting herself with him totally. Now Gregor lost his ability to see anything, her hands behind his father's head begging him to spare Gregor's life. So, Gregor now has an apple lodged in the back of his neck. And almost outright died from this. To the point where his sister had to step in. And I think that is... Fuck. Christ.
이 순간이 다 되어내리라.
지역 대체의 둔화를 확인. 대상 파괴. 철침탄.
I think I remember this. Yeah, this is like the moment all of this shit changes outside of, like, you know, the Metamorphosis.
숨을 다하도록 되어낼 뿐. 낮도 밤도 지나 숨을 다하도록 되어낼 뿐.
그래, 내가 왔다.
I was unable to watch from the beginning because I was having brunch with my family, but I think I already have an idea of what happens there. You missed like one of the most important scenes in the book, in my opinion.
내게 자비를 구하지 마라. 내 앞에는 무엇도 남지 않을 테니. 믿지 않았군.
Only thing that's confusing me is the motivations of his family. Like, why is his sister such an asshole?
있을 텐데.
It's just, wait, what? His sister is not an asshole to him. She's like the most considerate. She literally just begged for his life.
이쪽으로 와. 내가 안전하게 지켜줄 테니까.
I thought it was his sister who lodged the apple. No, it was the dad.
이 순간이 다 되어내리라.
Anyways, after this turn, I'm going to take a 5-minute break. Because my dogs need to come inside the house. I put them out like 30 minutes ago. They've just been chilling. So, yep, 5-minute break. We'll get back to it. Where the fuck is the outline? There it is. Bam. Save. Yep. I mean, have you seen someone of one team refract Ricardo with the new reissue? No. Anyways, I'll be back. I mean, he does take damage to slash skills, so I assume so. I just had a pleasant but short conversation with my neighbor when I was letting my dogs in and giving them water because it's pretty hot outside. So I told my neighbor, I'm going to pick up my mom later after he asked me how my day was, and he said, "Oh well, make sure to lift with your legs." And that made me giggle. He's really funny and nice. I gotta say, like, for moving into a new town entirely, I couldn't have asked for better neighbors. They've been so cool to me, and I appreciate them a lot. I wish I got to know them better, but they're pretty dope. It literally took me a second to process what they were saying, and like when it hit, that just like, well, you just moved. I moved in October, the end of October. So like, I'd say very recently. Also, banger neighbors. Yeah, no, they kick ass. Do y'all want to see a snippet of the thumbnail early? She is, my girlfriend is working like super fucking hard, and it looks amazing. It's here. I love how she drew his expression here. God, it kicks so much ass. Anyways, part 3. No one dared to remove the apple lodged in Gregor's flesh, so it remained there as a visible reminder of his injury. He had suffered it there for more than a month, and his condition seemed serious enough to remind even his father that Gregor, despite his current sad and revolting form, was a family member who could not be treated as an enemy. On the contrary, as a family, there was a duty to swallow any revulsion from him and to be patient. Just to be patient. Because of his injuries, Gregor had lost much of his mobility, probably permanently. He had been reduced to the condition of an ancient invalid, and it took him long minutes to crawl across this room. Crawling over the ceiling was out of the question, but this deterioration in his condition was fully, in his opinion, made up for by the door to the living room being left open every evening. He got into the habit of closely watching it for 1 or 2 hours before it was opened, and then, lying in the darkness of his rooms where he could not see it be seen from the living room, he could watch the family in the light of the dinner table and listen to the conversations, with everyone's permission in a way, and thus quite differently from before. One of my favorite books. Yeah, no, this book's very good. They no longer held the lively conversations of earlier times, of course. The ones that Gregor always thought about with longing was when he was tired and getting into the damp bed in some small hotel room. All of them were usually very quiet nowadays. Soon after dinner, his father would go to sleep in his chair. His mother and sister would urge each other to be quiet. His mother, bent deeply under the lamp, would sew fancy underwear for a fashion shop. His sister, who had taken a sales job, learned shorthand and French in the evenings so that she might be able to get a better position later on. Sometimes his father would wake up and say to Gregor's mother, "You're doing so much sewing again today," as if he did not know what he had been dozing. And then he would go back to sleep again while his mother and sister would exchange a tired grin. With a kind of stubbornness, Gregor's father refused to take his uniform off even at home. While his nightgown hung unused on its peg, Gregor's father would readily slumber where he was, fully dressed, as if always ready to serve and expecting to hear a voice of his superior even here. The uniform had not been new to start with, but as a result of this, it slowly became even shabbier despite the efforts of Gregor's mother and his sister to look after it. Gregor would often spend the whole evening looking at all the stains of his coat, with its gold buttons always kept polished and shiny, while the old man in it would sleep highly uncomfortable but peaceful. Okay, let's do a turn.
한 번에 끝낸다.
예측 그럼 아니야.
Jesus Christ.
낮도 밤도 지나 숨이 타도 베어낼 뿐 몸만 옅어지나 이 순간이 닿도록 베어내리라.
And let's just I'm gonna say get halfway done with this and then just like lock in on the reading, and then we'll finish this up once I finish the book.
앞을 밝히자. 후회할 것이 잘 보이도록.
So about 17 more enemies.
이 순간이 닿도록 베어내리라.
44, 45. Okay, so not too much left.
필중의 의지만 있다면
괜찮아. 이젠 안 아플 거야.
재장전.
이 순간이 닿도록 베어내리라.
일어나! 아직 11번은 죽어야 한다고!
Okay, just this wave.
그래, 내가 왔다.
대상 확인. 절침탄. 트랜지션. 어산탄. 임상시험 성공. 대상 확인. 절침탄. 트랜지션. 어산탄. 임상시험 성공.
이 순간이 닿도록 베어내리라. 원망도 옅어지나 원망도 옅어지나 원망도 옅어지나.
Oh. Girl, why was your SP so— oh, right, I use ego. Is this MD or just plain Cantonite itself? XP Luxcavation.
가만히 있어.
I have 52 out of 120 enemies, so I'm just getting till I'm 58.
단번에
이
끝낸다.
순간이 닿도록 베어내리라.
Like too zoomed in for stream to see. I know. No, I know.
원망도 옅어지나 원망도 옅어지나.
That's just because like I just straight alt tabbed into the game for my reading setup instead of just switching to my Limbus overlay thing.
중 격발. 완전 여유탄 횟수.
I see, so you can't fix it. I could just swap to the Limbus overlay, but I don't really wanna. I'm feeling lazy.
이쪽으로 와.
Okay, This is it.
내가 안전하게 지켜줄
And then we will just be straight up reading.
단번에 끝낸다.
이 순간이 다 되었느리라.
Are you doing consecutive activations? Yes. I'm doing 10 in a row. Anyways, turn 18. 60 out of 120. Cool. Alright. As soon as it struck 10, Gregor's mother would speak gently to his father to wake him and try to persuade him to go to bed. As he couldn't sleep properly where he was, and he had really to get his sleep if he was to be up to 6 to get back up to work. But since he had been in work, he had become more obstinate, and he would always insist on staying longer at the table, even though he regularly fell asleep, and it was then harder to even persuade him to exchange the chair for his bed. Then, however much mother and sister would importune him with little reproaches and warnings, he would keep slowly shaking his head for a quarter of an hour, with his eyes closed and refusing to get up. Gregor's mother would tug at his sleeve, whispering endearments into his ear. Gregor's sister would leave her work to help her mother, but nothing would have any effect on him. He would just sink deeper into his chair. Only when the two women took him under the arms, he would abruptly open his eyes and look at them after the other one after the other and say, "What a life! This is the peace I get in my old age!" And supported by the two women, he would lift himself up carefully as if he were carrying the greatest load himself, let the woman take him to the door, setting them off and carrying on by himself, while Gregor's mother would throw down her needle and his sister her pen so that they could run after his father and continue being of help to him. Who in this tired and overworked family would have had time to give more attention to Gregor than was absolutely necessary? The household budget became even smaller, so now the maid was dismissed. An enormous, thick-boned charwoman with white hair was flapped around her head, came every morning and evening to do the heaviest work. Everything else was looked after by Gregor's mother, on top of the large amount of sewing work she did. Gregor even learned, listening to the evening conversation about what price they had hoped for, that several items of jewelry belonging to the family had been sold, even though both mother and sister had been very fond of wearing them at functions and celebrations. But the loudest complaint was that although the flat was much too big for their present circumstances, they could not move out of it. There was no imaginable way of transferring Gregor to the new address. He could see quite well, though, that there were more reasons and consideration for him that made it difficult for them to move. It would have been easy to transport him in any suitable crate with a few air holes in it. The main thing holding the family back from their decision to move was much more to do with their total despair and the thought that they had been struck with a misfortune unlike anything experienced by anyone else they knew or related to. They carried out absolutely everything that the world expects from poor people. Gregor's father brought bank employees their breakfast, his mother sacrificed herself by washing clothes for strangers, his sister ran back and forth between her desk at the behest of the customers, but they did not have the strength to do any more, and the injury in Gregor's back began to hurt as much as when it was new. After they had come back from taking his father to bed, Gregor's mother and sister would leave their work where it was and sit close together, cheek to cheek. His mother would point to Gregor's room and say, "Close that door, Crede." And then, when he was in the dark again, they would sit in the next room and the tears would mingle, or they would simply sit there staring dry-eyed at the table. Gregor hardly slept at all, either night or day. Sometimes he would think of taking over the family's affairs just like before the next time the door was opened. He had long forgotten about his boss and the chief clerk, but they appear again in his thoughts. The sailmans and the apprentices, that stupid tea-boy, 2 or 3 friends from other businesses, one of the chambermaids from a provincial hotel, a tender memory that appeared and disappeared again, a cashier from a hat shop from whom his attention had been serious but too slow. All of them appeared to him, mixed together with strangers and others he had forgotten, but instead of helping him and his family, that they were all of them inaccessible, and he was glad when they disappeared. Other times he was not at all in the mood to look after his family,
he was filled with simple rage about the lack of attention he was shown, and although he could think of nothing he would have wanted, he made plans of how he could get into the pantry where he could take all the things he was entitled to, even if he was not hungry. Gregor's sister no longer thought about how she could please him, but would hurriedly push some food out or other into his room with her foot before she rushed out to work in the morning, and at midday and in the evening, she would sweep it away again with the broom, indifferent as to whether it had been eating or, more often than not, had been left totally untouched. She still cleared up the room in the evening, but now she could not have been any quicker about it. Smears of dirt were left on the walls. Here and there were little balls of dust and filth. At first, Gregor went into one of the worst of these places when his sister arrived as it reproached her, but he could have stayed there for weeks without his sister doing anything about it. She could see the dirt as well as he could, but she had simply decided to leave him to it. At the time, she began touching in a way that was quite new for her and which everyone in the family understood. Cleaning up Gregor's room was for her and her alone. Gregor's mother did once thoroughly clean his room and then needed to use several bucketfuls of water to do it, although that much dampness also made Gregor ill and he lay flat on the couch, bitter and immobile, but his mother was to be punished still more for what she had done, as hardly had his sister arrived in the home in the evening she noticed the change in Gregor's room, and, highly aggrieved, ran back into the living room where, despite her mother's raised tears and imploring hands, she broke down into convulsive tears. Her father, of course, was startled out of his chair, and the two parents looked on astonished and helpless. Then they too became agitated. Gregor's father, standing to the right of his mother, accused her of not leaving the cleaning of Gregor's room to his sister from her left. From her left, Gregor's sister screamed at her that she was never to clean Gregor's room again, while his mother tried to draw his father, who was beside himself of anger, into the bedroom. His sister, quaking with tears, thumped on the table with her small fists, and Gregor hissed in anger that no one had even thought of closing the door to save him the sight of this and all its noise. Gregor's sister was exhausted from going out to work, and looking after Gregor as she had done before was even more work for her, but even so, his mother ought certainly not to have taken her place. Gregor, on the other hand, ought not to be neglected. Now, though, the charwoman was here, this elderly widow with a robust bone structure that made her able to withstand the hardest of things in her long life, wasn't really repelled by Gregor. Just by chance one day, rather than any real curiosity, she opened the door to Gregor's room and found herself face to face with him. He was taken totally by surprise. No one was chasing him, but he began to rush to and fro while she just stood there in amazement with her hands crossed in front of her. From then on, she never failed to open the door slightly every evening and morning and looked briefly in on him. At first, she would call to him as she did with so words she probably considered friendly, such as, Come on then, you old dung beetle," or "Look at that old dung beetle over there." Okay. Hold on, I gotta send this to my girlfriend and apologize because I said Gregor can be not interpreted as a beetle. Turns out he is a fucking beetle. So yeah, I guess Gregor in source material is a beetle. That's my bet. Or Gregor never responded being spoken to in that way, but just remained where he was without moving as if the door never had been opened. If only they told this charwoman to clean up his room every day instead of letting her disturb him for no reason whenever she felt like it. So the cockroach thing was a Limbus creative decision. I assume it's because of the description at the beginning. You know, like Limbus likes to take the source material and like put their own little spin on it. Like the Jade Eye of Hong Lu being a fucking GoPro, you know. So, and Heathcliff's abusive ass getting turned into like a evil ass mirror world version of him, or Moby Dick becoming Yuri. You know, they like putting their own spin on it. One day, early in the morning, when most striking to me is how Canty 5 is basically just Moby Dick 2. Yeah, isn't it just like Ahab and Ishmael had their roles swapped, except like as an antagonist and protagonist thing. Okay, but Ishmael and Queequeg still had a homoerotic moment as men. Don Quixote being a vampire, that's true. Also, Sancho taking the Don Quixote name. They do put their own twist on it, which I think is very cool. One day, early in the morning, while a heavy rain struck the window panes, perhaps indicating that spring was coming, she began to speak to him in the way once again. Gregor was so resentful of it that he started to move towards her. He was kind of slow and infirm, but it was like a kind of attack. Instead of being afraid, the charwoman just lifted up one of the chairs from near door and just stood there with her mouth open. Clearly intended not to close her mouth until the chair in her hand had been slammed down into Gregor's back. "Aren't you coming any closer then?" she asked when Gregor turned round again. She calmly put the chair back in the corner. Gregor had almost entirely stopped eating. Only if he had happened to find himself next to the food that had been prepared for him, he might take some of it into his mouth to play with it, leave it there for a few hours, and then, more often than not, spit it out again. At first, he thought it was distress at the state of his room that stopped him from eating, but he had soon got used to the changes made there. They had gotten into the habit of putting things into this room that he had no room for elsewhere. And there were now so much things as one of the rooms in the flat that had been rented out to free gentlemen. And there are now many such things as one of the rooms in the flat had been rented out to 3 gentlemen. These earnest gentlemen, all 3 of them had full beards, as Gregor learned peering through the crack in the door one day, were painfully insistent on things being tidy. This meant not only in their own room, but since they had taken a room in this establishment, in the entire flat, and especially in the kitchen. Unnecessary clutter was something they could not tolerate, especially if it was dirty. They had moreover brought most of their own furnishings and equipment with them. For this reason, many things had become superfluous, however that word's pronounced, which, although they could not be sold, the family did not wish to discard. All these things found their way into Gregor's room. The dustbins from the kitchen found their way in there too. The charwoman was always in a hurry, and anything she couldn't use for the time being, she would usually just chuck in there. He fortunately would usually see no more than the object in the hand that held it. The woman most likely meant to fetch the things back out again when she had the time and the opportunity, or to throw everything out in one go. But what actually happened was that they were left where they landed when they had first been thrown, unless Gregor made his way through the junk and moved it elsewhere. At first he moved it because with no other room free where he could crawl about, he was forced to, but later on he came to enjoy, although moving about it in the way left him sad and tired to death, and he would remain immobile for hours afterwards. The gentlemen who rented the room would sometimes take their evening meal at home in the living room that was used by everyone, and so the door to this room was often kept closed in the evening, but Gregor found it easy to give up having the door open. He had, after all, often failed to make use of it when it was open, and without the family even noticed, lain in his room in the darkest corner. One time, though, the charwoman left the door to the living room slightly open, and it remained open when the gentleman who rented the room came in the evening and the light was put on. They sat up at the table where formerly Gregor had taken his meals with his father and mother. They unfolded the serviettes and picked up their knives and forks. Gregor's mother immediately appeared in the doorway with a dish of meat, and soon behind her came his sister with a dish piled high with potatoes. The food was steaming and filled with the room with its smell. The gentlemen bent over the dishes set in front of them as if they wanted to test the food before eating it. I'm starting to think Franz Kafka predicted the likes of Asmongold way ahead of time. That guy would hate Franz Kafka because he's a Nazi. The gentleman bent over the dishes set in front of them as if they wanted to test the food before eating them, and the gentleman in the middle, who seemed to count as an authority for the other two, did indeed cut off a piece of meat while it was still in its dish, clearly wishing to establish whether it was sufficiently cooked or whether it should be sent to the kitchen. It was to his satisfaction, and Gregor's mother and sister, who had been looking on anxiously, began to breathe again and smiled. The family themselves ate in the kitchen. Nonetheless, Gregor's father came into the living room before he went into the kitchen, bowed once with his cap in his hand, and did his round of the table. The gentlemen stood as one and mumbled something into their beards. Then, once they were alone, they ate in near perfect silence. It seemed remarkable to Gregor that all of the various noises of eating their chewing teeth could still be heard, as if they wanted to show Gregor that you need teeth in order to eat, as it was not possible to perform anything with jaws that are toothless, however nice they might be. "I'd like to eat something," said Gregor anxiously, "but not anything like they're eating. They do feed themselves, and here I am, dying." Throughout all this time, Gregor could not remember having heard the violin being played, but this time it began to be heard from the kitchen. The three gentlemen had already finished their meal. The one in the middle had produced a newspaper, given a page to each of the others, and now they leant back in their chairs, reading them and smoking. When the violin began playing, they became attentive, stood up, and went on to tiptoe over to the door of the hallway, where they stood pressed against each other. Someone must have heard them in the kitchen, as Gregor's father called out, Is the playing perhaps unpleasant for the gentleman? We can stop it straight away." "On the contrary," said the mental gentleman, "would the young lady not like us to come in and play for us here in the room, where it is, after all, much more cozy and comfortable?" "Oh, yes, we'd love to," called back Gregor's father, as if he'd been the violin player himself. The gentleman stepped back into the room and waited. Gregor's father soon appeared with the music stand, his mother with the music, and his sister with the violin. She calmly prepared everything for her to begin playing. His parents, who had never rented a room out before and therefore showed an exaggerated courtesy towards the three gentlemen, did not even dare to sit on their own chairs. His father leaned against the door with his right hand pushed in between two buttons on his uniform coat. His mother, though, was offered a seat by one of the gentlemen and sat, leaving the chair where the gentleman happened to have it placed, out of the way in a corner. His sister began to play. Father and mother paid close attention, one on each side, to the movements of her hands. Drawn in by the painting, Gregor had dared to come forward a little and had already had his head in the living room. Before, he had taken great pride in how considerate he was, but it hardly occurred to him that he had become so thoughtless about the others. What's more, there was now all the more reason to keep himself hidden, as he was covered in the dust that lay everywhere in his room and flew up at the slightest moment. He carried threads, hairs, and grains of food about on his back and sides. He was much too indifferent to everything now to lay on his back and wipe himself on the carpet like he had used to do several times a day. And despite this condition, he was not too shy to move forward a little onto the immaculate floor of the living room. No one noticed him, though. The family was totally preoccupied with the violin playing. At first, the three gentlemen had put their hands in their pockets and all come up too far close behind the music stand to look at all the notes being played, and they must have disturbed Gregor's sister, but soon, in contrast with the family, they withdrew back to the window with their heads sunk and talking to each other at half volume. Side note, I highly recommend reading Kafka's letters to his father too, to get more context on Kafka's relationship with Herman, and what might possibly entail in the future for Limbus Gregor. How long is that? I'll consider it for the video. Anyways. It really now seemed very obvious that they had expected to hear some beautiful and entertaining violin playing, but had been disappointed that they had enough of the whole performance, as it was only now out of politeness that they allowed their peace to be disturbed. It was especially unnerving the way they all blew smoke from their cigarettes upwards from their mouths and noses. Yet Gregor's sister was playing so beautifully. Her face was leant to one side, following the lines of music with a careful and melancholy expression. Gregor called out a little further forward, keeping his head close to the ground so he could meet her eyes if the chance came. Was he an animal if the music could captivate him so? It seemed to him that he had been shown the way to an unknown nourishment he had been yearning for. He was determined to make his way forward to his sister and tug at her skirt to show her she might come into his room with her violin, as no one appreciated her playing her as much as he would. He never wanted to let her out of his room. Not while he lived, anyway. His shocking appearance, around 45 to 50 pages if I remember. Okay, I'll read it for the video later. Should, for once, be of some use to him. He wanted to be at every door of his room at once, to hiss and spit at the attackers. His sister should not be forced to stay with him, though, but stay of her own free will. She would sit beside him on the couch with her ear bent down to him, while he told her how he had always intended to send her to the conservatory. How he would have told everyone about it last Christmas. Had Christmas really come and gone already? If this misfortune hadn't gotten in the way and refused to let anyone dissuade him from it, on hearing all this, his sister would break out in tears of emotion, and Gregor would come back up to her shoulder and kiss her neck, which, since she had been going out to work, she had kept free without any necklace or collar. "Mr. Samsa!" shouted the middle gentleman to Gregor's father, pointing, without wasting any more words, with his forefinger at Gregor as he slowly moved forward. The violin went silent. The middle of the three gentlemen first smiled at his two friends, shaking his head, and then looked back at Gregor. His father seemed to think it was more important to calm the three gentlemen before driving Gregor out. Even though they were not at all upset and seemed to think Gregor was more entertaining than the violin had been played. He rushed up to them with his arms spread out and attempted to drive them back into the room at the same time as trying to block their view of Gregor with his body. Now they did become a little annoyed, and it was not clear whether it was his father's behavior that annoyed them or the dawning realization that they had a neighbor like Gregor in the next room without knowing it. They asked Gregor's father for explanations, raised their arms like he had, tugged excitedly at their beards, and moved back towards their room only very slowly. Meanwhile, Gregor's sister had overcome the despair she had fallen into when her playing was suddenly interrupted. She had let her hands drop and let the violin bow hang limply for a while before continuing to look at the music as if still playing, but then she suddenly pulled herself together, laid the instrument on her mother's lap, who still sat laboriously struggling for breath where she was, and ran into the next room which, under pressure from her father, the three gentlemen were quickly moving toward. Under her sister's experienced hand, the pillows and covers on the bed flew up and were put into order as she already finished making the beds and slipped out again before the three gentlemen had reached the room. Gregor's father seemed so obsessed with what he was doing that he forgot all the respect he owed to his tenants. He urged them and pressed them until, when he was already at the door of the room, the middle of the three gentlemen shouted like thunder and stamped his foot and brought Gregor's father to halt. "I declare here now," he said, raising his hand and glancing at Gregor's mother and sister to gain their attention too, "that with regard to the repugnant conditions that prevail in this flat and with this family," he looked briefly but decisively at the floor, "I give immediate notice on my room. For the days that I have been living here, I will, of course, pay nothing at all. On the contrary, I will consider whether to proceed with some kind of action for damage from you, and believe me, it would be very easy to set on grounds for such an action." He was silent and looked straight ahead as if waiting for something, and indeed his two friends joined in with the words, "And we will also give immediate notice." With that, he took hold of the door handle and slammed the door. Gregor's father staggered back to his seat, feeling his way with his hands, and fell into it. Okay, but imagine renting out an Airbnb and you find Gregor living in a room you're completely unaware of. I'm not gonna, call them unjustified for reacting like that, but knowing what we know, it's hard not to look at them like assholes. Especially, with the way they were treating, Greta. Gregor's father staggered back to his seat, feeling his way with his hands, and fell into it. It looked as if he was stretching himself out for his usual evening nap from the uncontrolled way his head was kept nodding. It could be seen that he was not sleeping at all. For all this, Gregor had lain there still where the gentleman had first seen him. His disappointment at the failure of his plan, and perhaps also because he was weak from hunger, made it impossible for him to move. He was sure that everyone would turn on him any moment, and he waited. He was not even startled out of his state when the violin in his mother's lap fell from her trembling fingers and landed loudly on the floor. "Father, Mother," said his sister, hitting the table with her hands as an introduction. "We can't carry on like this. Maybe you can't see it, but I can. I don't want to call this monster my brother. All I can say is we have to try and get rid of it. We've done all that's humanly possible to look after it and be patient. I don't think anyone could accuse us of doing anything wrong." "She's absolutely right," said Gregor's father to himself. His mother, who still had not had time to catch her breath, began to cough dully, her hand held out in front of her and deranged expression in her eyes. Gregor's sister rushed to his mother and put her hand on her forehead. Her words seemed to give Gregor's father some more definite ideas. He sat upright, played with his uniform cap between the plates left by the three gentlemen after the meal. And occasionally looked down at Gregor as he lay there immobile. "We have to try and get rid of it," said Gregor's sister, now speaking only to her father as her mother was too occupied with coughing to listen. "It'll be the death of both of you. I can see it coming. We can't all work as hard as we have to and then come home to be tortured like this. We can't endure it. I can't endure it anymore." and she broke out so heavily in tears that they flowed down her face onto her mother. She wiped them away with mechanical hand movements. "My child," said her father, with sympathy and obvious understanding. "What are we to do?" His sister just shrugged her shoulders as a sign of helplessness and tears that had taken hold of her, displacing her earlier certainty. If he could just understand us," said his father almost as a question. His sister shook her hand vigorously through the tears as a sign of that there was no question. "If he could just understand us," repeated Gregor's father, closing his eyes in acceptance of his sister's certainty that was quite impossible. "Then perhaps we could come to some kind of arrangement with him, but as it is..." "It's got to go!" shouted his sister. "That's the only way, father. You've got to get rid of the idea that that's Gregor. We've only harmed ourselves by believing it for so long. How can that be Gregor? If it were Gregor to have seen long ago that it's not possible for human beings to live with an animal like that, and we would have gone of his own free will. We wouldn't have a brother anymore then. But we could carry on with our lives, remember him with respect. As it is, the animal is obviously persecuting us. It's driven out our tenants, obviously wants to take over the whole flat and force us to sleep on the street. Father, look! Just look!" she suddenly screamed. "He's starting again!" In her alarm, which totally beyond Gregor's comprehension, his sister even abandoned his mother as she pushed herself vigorously out of her chair as if more willing to sacrifice her own mother than stay anywhere near Gregor. She rushed over to behind her father, who had become excited merely because she was, and stood up, half raising his hands in front of Gregor's sister as if to protect her. But Gregor had no intention of frightening anyone, least of all his sister. All he had done was begin to turn around so that he could go back into his room. Although that was in itself quite startling, as his pain-wrecked condition meant that turning around required a great deal of effort, and he was using his head to help himself do it, repeatedly raising and striking against the floor. He stopped and looked around. They seemed to have realized his good intention and had only been alarmed briefly. Now they all looked at him in unhappy silence. His mother lay in her chair with her legs stretched out and pressed against each other, her eyes nearly closed with exhaustion. His sister sat next to his father with her arms around his neck. "Maybe now they'll let me turn around," thought Gregor, and went back to work. He could not help panting loudly with the effort and sometimes stop and take a rest. No one was making him rush anymore. Everything was left up to him. As soon as he finally finished turning around, he began to move straight ahead. He was made at the great distance that separated him from his room, and could not understand how he covered that distance in his weak state a little while before and fast without noticing it. And almost without noticing it. He concentrated on crawling as fast as he could, and hardly noticed that there was not a word, not a cry from his family to distract him. He did not turn his head until he had reached the doorway. He did not turn it all the way around as he felt his neck becoming stiff, but was nonetheless enough to see that nothing behind him had changed. Only his sister had stood up. With his last glance, he saw that his mother had now completely fallen asleep. He was hardly inside his room before the door was hurriedly shut, bolted, and locked. The sudden noise behind Gregor so startled him that his little legs collapsed under him. It was his sister who had been in so much of a rush. She had been standing there waiting and sprung forward lightly. Gregor had not heard her coming in at all. And as soon as she turned the key in the lock, she said loudly to her parents, "At last!" "What now, then?" Gregor asked himself as he looked around in the darkness. He soon made the discovery that he could no longer move at all. This was no surprise to him. It seemed rather that being able to actually move around on those spindly little legs until then was unnatural. He also felt relatively comfortable. It is true that his entire body was aching, but the pain seemed to be slowly getting weaker and weaker, and would finally disappear altogether. He could already feel the decayed apple in his back of the inflamed area around it, which was entirely covered in white dust. He thought back of his family with emotion and love. If it was possible, he felt that he must go away even more strongly than his sister. He remained in the state of empty and peaceful rumination until he heard the clock tower strike 3 in the morning. He watched as it slowly began to get light everywhere outside the window too. Then, without his willing it, his head sank down completely, and his last breath flowed weakly from his nostrils. Gregor Samsa died. When the cleaner came in early in the morning, they'd often asked her not to keep slamming the doors, but with her strength and in a hurry, she did, so that everyone in the flat knew she arrived, and from then on, it was impossible to sleep in peace. She made her usual brief look in on Gregor, and the first found nothing special. She thought he was laying there so still on purpose, playing the martyr. She attributed all possible understanding to him. She happened to be holding the long broom in her hand, so she tried to tickle Gregor with it from the doorway. When she had no success with that, she tried to make a nuisance of herself and poked him a little. And only then, when she found she could shove him across the floor with no resistance at all, did she start to pay attention. She soon realized what had really happened, opened her eyes wide, whistled to herself, but did not waste time to yank open the bedroom doors and shout loudly into the darkness of the bedrooms, "Come and have a look at this! It's dead! Just lying there, stone dead!" Mr. and Mrs. Samsa sat upright in their marriage bed and had to make an effort to get over the shock that caused by the cleaner before they could grasp what she was saying. But then, each from his own size, they hurried out of bed. Mr. Samsa threw the blanket over his shoulders. Mrs. Samsa just came out in their nightdress, and that's how they went into Gregor's room. On the way, they opened the door to the living room where Gray had been sleeping since the three gentlemen had moved in. She was fully dressed as if she'd never been asleep, and the paleness of her face seemed to confirm this. "Dead?" asked Miss Samsa, looking at the chairwoman inquiringly, even though she could check for herself and she could have known it even without checking. "That's what I said," replied the cleaner, and to prove it, she gave Gregor's body another shove with the broom, sending it sideways across the floor. Miss Samsa made a movement as if she wanted to hold back the broom, but did not complete it. "Now then, Mr. Samsa," said Mr. Samsa, "let's give thanks to God for that." He crossed himself, and the three women followed his example. Grete, who had not taken her eyes from the corpse, said, Just look how thin he was. He didn't eat anything for so long. The food came out again just at the same time it went in." Gregor's body was indeed completely dried up and flat. They had not seen it until then, but now he was not lifted up on his little legs, nor did he do anything to make them look away. "Grete, come with us in here for a little while," said Mrs. Samsa with a pained smile. Grete followed her parents into the bedroom, but not without looking back at the body. Clear shut the door and opened the window wide. Although it was still early in the morning, the fresh air had something of warmth mixed within it. It was already the end of March, after all. The three gentlemen stepped out of their rooms and looked around in amazement for their breakfast they had been forgot about. "Where is our breakfast?" the middle gentleman asked the cleaner irritably. She just put her fingers on her lips and made a quick and silent gesture to the men so they might like to come into Gregor's room. The headstones stood around Gregor's corpse with their hands in the pockets of their war-worn coats. It was now quite light in the room. Then the door of the bedroom opened and Mr. Samsa appeared in his uniform with his wife in one arm and his daughter in the other. All of them had been crying a little. Grete now and then pressed her face against her father's arm. "Leave my home, now!" said Mr. Samsa, indicating the door and without letting the woman from him. "What do you mean?" asked the middle of the three gentlemen, somehow disconcerted, and he smiled sweetly. The other two held their hands behind their backs and continually rubbed them together in the gleeful anticipation of a loud quarrel, which could only end in their favor. "I mean just what I said," answered Mr. Samsa, and with this, his two companions went in a straight line towards the man. At first, he stood there, looking at the ground as if the content of his head were rearranging themselves in new position. "All right, we'll go then," he said, and looked up at Mr. Samsa as if he had been suddenly overcome with humility and wanted permission again from Mr. Samsa from his decision. Mr. Samsa merely opened his eyes wide and briefly nodded to him several times. And at that, and without delay, the man actually did take long strides in the front hallway. His two friends had stopped rubbing their hands some time before and had been listening to what was being said. Now they jumped off after their friend, as if taken with a sudden fear that Mr. Samsa might go into the hallway in front of them and break the connection with their leader. Once there, all three took their hats from the stand, took their sticks from the holder, bowed without a word, and left the premises. Mr. Samsa and the two women followed them out onto the landing, but they had no reason to mistrust the men's intentions, and as they leaned over the landing, they saw the three gentlemen made slow but steady progress down many of the steps. As they turned the corner on each floor, they disappeared and would reappear a few months later. The further down they went, the more that the Samsa family lost interest in them. When a butcher's boy, proud of posture with his tray on his head, passed them on his way up and came near there, Mr. Samsa and the woman came away from the landing and went, as if relieved, back into the flat. They decided the best way to make use of that day was for relaxation and to go for a walk. Not only had they earned a break from work, but they were in serious need of it, so they sat at a table and wrote letters of the excusal. Mr. Samsa to his employers, Mrs. Samsa to her contractor, and Grete to her principal. The cleaner came in while they were writing to tell them she was going. She'd finished her work for that morning. The three of them at first nodded without looking up from what they were writing, and it was only when the cleaner still did not seem to want to leave that they looked up in irritation. Well, asked Mr. Samsa. The charwoman stood in the doorway with a smile on her face as if she had some tremendous good news to report, but would only do it if she was clearly asked to. The almost vertical little ostrich feather on her hat, which had been a source of irritation to Mr. Samsa all the time she had been working for them, swayed gently in all directions. What is it you want, then? Whom the cleaner had the most respect, asked Mr. Samsa, whom the cleaner had the most respect for. Yes, she answered, and broke into a friendly laugh that made her unable to speak straight away. Well then, that thing you got in there, you needn't worry about how you're going to get rid of it. That's all been sorted out. Mrs. Samsa and Grady bent over their letters as if intending to continue with what they were writing. Mr. Samsa saw that the cleaner wanted to start describing everything in detail, but with outstretched hand, he made it quite clear that she was not to. So, as she was prevented from telling them all about it, she suddenly remembered what a hurry she was in, and clearly peeved, she called out, "Cheerio then, everybody." Turned sharply and left, slamming the door terribly as she went. Tonight she gets sacked, said Mr. Samsa, but he received no reply from either his wife or his daughter, as the charwoman seemed to have destroyed the peace they had only just gained. They got up and went over to the window where they remained with their arms around each other. Mr. Samsa twisted round his chair to look at them and sat there watching for a while. Then he called out, "Come here then. Let's forget all about all that old stuff, shall we? Come and give me a bit of attention." Two women immediately did as he had said, hurrying over to him where they kissed him and hugged him, and then they quickly finished their letters. After that, the three of them left the flat together, which is not something they had done for months, and they took the tram out to the open country outside the town. They had the tram filled with warm sunshine all to themselves. Leant back comfortably on their seats, they discussed their prospects and found that on a closer examination they were not at all bad. Until then, they never asked each other what about their work, but all three had jobs which were very good and held particularly good promise for the future. The greatest improvement for the time being, of course, would be achieved quite easily by moving house. What they needed now was a flat that was smaller and cheaper than the current one, that had been chosen by Gregor, one that was in a better location and, most of all, more practical. All the time, Grete was become livelier. With all the worry they had been having of late, her cheeks had become pale, but while they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Samsa were struck almost simultaneously with the thought of how their daughter was blossoming into a well-built and beautiful young lady. They became quieter, just from each other's glance, and almost without knowing it, they agreed that it would soon be time to find a good man for her. And, as if in confirmation of their new dreams and good intentions, as soon as they reached their Grete as their destination, Grete was the first to get up and stretch out her young body. That is the end of Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. I think the book's good. Very good book. In me think. Wait, so what even happened with Gregor's corpse? I don't actually know. I assume that it was dissolved. But we won't know. Anyways, I'm gonna finish this up, and we're gonna do one more thing. We're gonna finish this shit up, and one more thing for the stream. For the culture. Remember I thought the cleaner lady had butchered him and ate him for dinner? Yeah, I'm gonna eat a beetle. The way she was happy to say it felt almost like sadistic, you know?
단번에 끝낸다.
Honestly, I love how goddamn decrepit this book's writing is. Such a stark contrast with the stranger being oddly clean and calculated. Yeah, that's because this is done from third person rather than like first person.
낮도 밤도 지 숨이 타도록 배워낼 것 예측 그럼 아니야 이 순간이 다음으로 배워내리라 낮도 밤도 지 숨이 타도록 배워낼 것 원망도 엿퍼지나 원망도 엿퍼지나
Anyways,
재장전.
yeah, reload king.
앞을 밝히자. 후회할 것이 잘 보이도록.
어쩌네 이겨주지.
애고 감도 증폭.
대상 확. 철침탄. 트랜지션. 확산탄. 임상시험 성공.
It does feel like the narrator of the book has a book section with how they describe some parts of it, which I love. My girlfriend has a bug obsession.
낮도 밤도 지 숨이 타도록 배워낼 것
I want to let everybody know here that on my first read through of this book, I cried at the ending. That ending really upset me.
이 순간이 다음으로 배워내리라
This is not a mirror dungeon. This is 99.99 outside of mirror dungeon is fucking absurd.
여유탄 횟수.
그려낸 뒤 배운 원망도 엿퍼지나 배운 원망도 엿퍼지나 예측 그럼 아니면 몰아치는 것을 처절한 원망 낮도 밤도 지 숨이 타도록
Gregor would have rather died than see his family suffer.
그려낸 뒤
대상 확. 철침탄. 트랜지션. 확산탄. 임상시험 성공.
낮도 밤도 지 숨이 타도록 배워낼 것
보여줄 테니.
이 순간이 닿도록 배워내리라 원망도 엿퍼지나
이쪽으로 와. 내가 안전하게 지켜줄 테니까.
그려낸 대로 배우는 원망도 엿하지나
그래, 네가 왔다.
배우는
조선의
원망도 엿하지나
True, Gregor already sacrificed his well-being for most of his slaying when his job, so yeah, why would he randomly be so selfish after becoming a bug?
배우는 이 순간이 다
Yeah,
배우니리라
but he's only human, so he did have like a few selfish moments, but I will say they were quite rare.
지역의 제일
낮도 밤도 치 숨이 타도록 배우는 이 순간이 다도록 배우니리라 원망도 엿하지나
이쪽으로 와. 내가 안전하고 감도.
이 순간이
좀.
다도록 배우니리라 배우는 원망도 엿하지나 예측 그럼
Last one.
단번에
이
끝낸다.
순간이 다도록 배우
Then we can do the quote unquote secret portion of the stream.
낮도 밤도 치 숨이 타도록 배우는
대상 밖 처침탄 여유탄 수
거창을 새겨주지.
앞을 밝히자. 후회할 것이 잘 보이다. 지금 구해줄 테니.
Secret portion, we're getting stream DLC. Yes, you are. Don't worry about it. You'll see.
완벽한 한 발을 위해
괜찮아. 이젠 안 아플 거야.
낮도 밤도 치 숨이 타도록 배우는
Okay. Hold on. Let me get Rememberoids for this. It's, how many XP tickets do I get from this? I forgot. Oh, 60. Nice. Hold on a second. Almost there. Okay, get you. That.
그래. 내가 왔다.
Let's see what we can take from the book from this fight. I'm gonna be honest, I don't got much in my mind. It's just raw. It seems to be more tied in Perman overall. Than anything.
아무것도 남지 마라.
Gregor lacking a pride sin skill while having the other, showing how he has a habit to put others before him. That's actually a good point.
날 정확하게.
He does have every skill except pride. You're right. His dialogue about shooting and infesting could reflect how his sister thought he would take the house for himself. That's actually really true. Good catch. Oh, no more shields.
그래. 내가 왔다.
He mentioned about pillows and corners. Oh, yeah, that's right. Like how he stayed in the dark corner.
지키기 위해서. 지키기 위해서. 지키기 위해서.
어스타네 새겨주지. 이놈 목상이다. 갇히지가 않아도 목숨을 걸지. 그래, 내가 왔다. 털만한 것들. 어스타네 새겨주지.
Manic being named Kill Me also makes so much sense of him. He really doesn't like making trouble for others.
차라리 아무것도 남지 마라.
마침내 황제가 다스리는 것에도 끝이 보이나.
날카롭고 정확하게. 날카롭고 정확하게.
나가봐라.
Oh shit, she won that? Pleasantly surprised.
俺たちは
I think he dies this turn.
샤리 가자.
아름다운 춤을 추는 건 나뿐이어야 해. 그러니 네 발목을 잘라버리면
장난이 길었군. 난 사양이다.
Almost.